Hello everyone. Tonight, I've prepared a special compilation of trucker tales, all gathered into one soothing episode for you to enjoy. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It really helps support the channel. Now, let's begin. The Weight of What Wasn't Mine, from Marcus DeLuca. The first thing any long-haul trucker learns is to trust the manifest. Every pound, every crate, every piece of cargo has to be accounted for before you roll out of the yard. I've been driving 18-wheelers for 23 years, hauling everything from furniture to frozen foods across the interstate highways that connect our sprawling country like arteries in some massive sleeping body. In all that time, I've never questioned what was listed on my paperwork until that humid August night when I discovered something in my trailer that shouldn't have existed. The run started simple enough. A straightforward haul from Phoenix to Atlanta, carrying what the manifest described as industrial equipment for a manufacturing company I'd delivered to before. The weight distribution felt right when I did my pre-trip inspection, and the seal on the trailer doors matched the number on my documentation. Everything by the book, just the way I like it. The dispatcher, a tired-looking woman named Helen who'd been working the night shift for as long as I'd been coming through this particular depot, handed me the keys with her usual grunt of acknowledgement. Nothing seemed unusual about the load or the routine. I pulled out of the Phoenix yard just as the sun was setting behind the desert mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with this job in the first place. The evening air was still thick with heat, but my cab's air conditioning hummed reliably as I merged onto Interstate 10, settling into the familiar rhythm of highway driving. The engine of my Peterbilt 379 purred with the deep, steady rumble that had become as comforting to me as a heartbeat over the years. Mile after mile passed beneath my wheels as I drove through the gathering darkness, the landscape gradually shifting from desert scrub to rolling hills. It was somewhere outside El Paso, around 2 in the morning, when I first noticed the sound. At first I thought it might be something wrong with my rig, maybe a loose mud flap or a problem with the trailer's suspension. But this wasn't mechanical noise. It was softer, more organic, like a rhythmic tapping or scratching coming from somewhere behind me. I pulled over at the next truck stop, a lonely oasis of neon lights surrounded by darkness, and walked around my trailer with a flashlight, checking every panel and joint. The tapping stopped the moment I stepped out of the cab, leaving only the distant hum of highway traffic and the buzz of sodium vapor lights. The trailer looked exactly as it should. The doors were still sealed, the lock intact, and there were no signs of damage or tampering. I knocked on the side panels, listening for any shift in the cargo, but heard only the dull thud of metal against whatever was properly secured inside. A couple of other drivers were taking their mandatory rest breaks nearby, and I nodded to them as I completed my inspection. Everything seemed normal, yet something felt fundamentally wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. The air around the trailer felt heavier somehow, as if the space itself was holding its breath. Back in the cab, I tried to dismiss the unease as fatigue, playing tricks on my mind. Long-haul driving can do that to you, especially during those dead hours before dawn, when your brain starts manufacturing problems that don't exist. I adjusted my mirrors, checked my GPS route, and pulled back onto the interstate, letting the familiar motion of driving soothe my nerves. The radio crackled with the distant voices of other truckers, sharing information about traffic conditions and weather reports, their conversations a comforting reminder that I wasn't alone out here in the vast darkness. But the tapping resumed about an hour later, more insistent now, coming in irregular patterns that almost sounded like Morse code. I turned down the radio and listened carefully, trying to determine exactly where the sound was originating. It seemed to be coming from the front section of the trailer, near where the cargo would be most densely packed according to my loading diagram. The manifest listed 3 large pieces of industrial machinery, each weighing several thousand pounds and properly secured with chains and straps. There was no way any of that equipment could be moving around loose, and even if it were, the sound would be much louder and more violent. The tapping continued intermittently as I drove through New Mexico and into Texas, always stopping whenever I pulled over to investigate. I began to time the intervals, noting that the sounds came most frequently during the quiet stretches between cities, when the highway was empty and the night pressed close around my truck like a living thing. Sometimes I heard what sounded almost like voices, muffled and indistinct, as if people were having a conversation just beyond the range of understanding. But that was impossible. I had loaded the cargo myself, watched every piece go into the trailer under the supervision of the depot foreman. Dawn was breaking over the Texas Panhandle when I stopped at a large truck stop complex for fuel and a proper meal. The morning light felt reassuring after hours of darkness, and the sight of other drivers going about their routines helped normalize the strangeness of the night. I called the dispatch office to report my position and estimated arrival time, but when I mentioned hearing unusual sounds from the trailer, the dispatcher seemed confused. He pulled up my load information on his computer and confirmed that everything matched what I'd been given in Phoenix. Industrial equipment properly secured, no special handling requirements. After fueling up, I decided to take another look at my paperwork while eating breakfast in the truck stop diner. The manifest seemed straightforward enough, but as I studied it more carefully, I noticed something odd about the shipping labels. The equipment was being delivered to a company called Meridian Industrial Solutions, but when I tried to look them up on my phone, I couldn't find any information about them online. No website, no business listings, not even a mention in any industrial directories. The delivery address was listed as a warehouse complex in an industrial district outside Atlanta, but something about the whole arrangement was beginning to feel wrong. I called the Phoenix depot and asked to speak with Helen, but the day shift supervisor told me she hadn't worked there in over 3 years. When I described her and mentioned that she'd given me the keys just yesterday, he insisted that no one matching that description was employed at their facility. The confusion in his voice was genuine, and a cold knot began forming in my stomach as I realized that something was very wrong with this entire situation. I asked him to check his computer system for my load, but after several minutes of searching, he came back with information that made no sense at all. According to their records, I was supposed to be hauling a load of furniture from Phoenix to Denver, not industrial equipment to Atlanta. The trailer I was pulling didn't match the one assigned to that route, and the manifest I was carrying didn't exist in their system. When I gave him the trailer number stenciled on the side panels, there was a long pause before he told me that particular trailer had been reported stolen from a depot in Oklahoma 2 weeks ago. The police had been looking for it ever since. My hands were shaking as I hung up the phone and walked back out to the parking lot where my rig waited in the morning sunlight. The trailer looked exactly the same as it had when I'd picked it up, but now I was seeing it through different eyes. How had I ended up with stolen cargo and forged paperwork without realizing it? Who was the woman who had given me the keys, and what was really sealed inside that trailer? The tapping sounds I'd been hearing took on a new and terrifying significance as I considered the possibilities. I stood beside the trailer for several minutes, listening carefully, and heard nothing but the whisper of wind across the metal surfaces. But as I placed my hand against the side panel, I could swear I felt a vibration, as if something inside was moving very gently back and forth. The sensation was subtle but unmistakable, like the movement of water or the breathing of some large creature. I pressed my ear to the metal and heard what sounded like voices again, multiple people talking in hushed tones just beyond the barrier that separated us. The smart thing would have been to call the police immediately and report the situation, but something held me back. Perhaps it was professional pride, or maybe just the trucker's instinct to handle problems independently, but I decided to continue toward the delivery address and see what I could learn there. If the cargo was stolen, then whoever was expecting it would have answers about how I'd become involved. And if there really were people trapped inside the trailer, as the sounds seemed to suggest, then I needed to get them help as quickly as possible. The drive through Texas and into Louisiana took on a surreal quality as I struggled with the mystery of my cargo. Every sound from the trailer seemed amplified, and I found myself constantly checking my mirrors, expecting to see police cars or something worse pursuing me down the highway. The voices became more distinct as the day progressed, sometimes rising to what sounded almost like arguments before fading back to whispers. I tried calling out to them through the cab's sliding window, asking if anyone was there, but received no response that I could be certain wasn't just my imagination. By evening I had reached the outskirts of Atlanta, following GPS directions to the delivery address through increasingly rundown neighborhoods. Voices from home, from Marcus Sullivan. The old Kenworth's radio had been acting up for weeks, cycling through static and dead air between the few stations that reached this far into nowhere. I'd been driving the night shift between Denver and Salt Lake for nearly 15 years, and I knew every mile of this lonely stretch like the lines on my weathered hands. The mountain passes twisted through darkness so complete it seemed to swallow my headlights, leaving only small pools of yellow light dancing across cracked asphalt and the occasional reflective road sign. Tonight felt different somehow, heavier, like the air itself was holding its breath. Rain had started falling about an hour back, not the usual mountain drizzle but fat drops that drummed against the windshield with increasing urgency. The wipers swept back and forth in their hypnotic rhythm, creating brief moments of clarity before the glass clouded again with streaming water. My cargo of farming equipment shifted slightly in the trailer behind me as I navigated another hairpin curve, the weight settling with a deep metallic groan that I felt more than heard through the cab's steel frame. I reached for the radio dial again, more out of habit than hope. Static filled the cab, punctuated by brief glimpses of distant music that faded as quickly as they appeared. The loneliness of the road was something I'd grown accustomed to over the years, but lately it seemed to press against me with unusual weight. Sarah had been gone for 3 months now, and the kids barely called anymore. The house back in Grand Junction felt more like a museum than a home whenever I managed a few days off between runs. As I turned the dial slowly through the frequencies, something caught my attention. Not music this time, but voices. Faint at first, buried beneath layers of atmospheric interference, but definitely human conversation. I adjusted the volume and fine-tuned the frequency, leaning forward slightly to catch the words. The voices grew clearer, and my blood seemed to slow in my veins as recognition dawned. It was Sarah's laugh, unmistakably hers, that bright sound that had drawn me to her at a roadhouse in Flagstaff 22 years ago. But Sarah had been dead since February, taken by a cancer that ate through her like acid through metal. I'd held her hand in that sterile hospital room as the machines finally went quiet, watched the light fade from her eyes like headlights disappearing around a distant curve. The radio crackled and her voice came through clearer now. She was talking to someone about dinner plans, mentioning how I'd be home soon and asking what I might want to eat. The casual domesticity of it made my chest tighten. I could picture her standing in our kitchen, phone tucked between her shoulder and ear while she stirred something on the stove, still wearing the blue apron with tiny flowers that I'd bought her for our anniversary years ago. He'd be 24 now, working construction in Phoenix and barely keeping in touch except for obligatory holiday calls. But this voice sounded different, lighter somehow, carrying the enthusiasm I remembered from when he was still in high school, before life had worn some of the shine off his dreams. He was talking about baseball tryouts, asking Sarah if she thought I'd make it to the game on Saturday. The rain intensified, and I had to grip the steering wheel tighter as wind gusts pushed against the truck's bulk. Lightning flickered somewhere behind the mountain peaks, illuminating the clouds from within like a broken fluorescent bulb. The radio signal remained steady despite the weather, crystal clear voices from my past painting pictures of a life that no longer existed. My daughter Emma's voice came through next, and the sound of it nearly made me pull over. She'd been 16 when the accident took her, just learning to drive, excited about her first real boyfriend, and complaining about homework with the dramatic flair that only teenage girls could muster. But the voice on the radio wasn't frozen at 16. This Emma sounded older, mature, talking about college courses and part-time jobs, and plans for the future she'd never gotten to see. They were discussing me as if I were simply running late, caught in traffic or delayed by a difficult load. Sarah mentioned how hard I'd been working lately, how the long hauls were wearing on me, but that the money was good and we needed to pay down Emma's student loans. There was no mention of funerals or grief, or the crushing silence that had filled our house after everything fell apart. In their conversation we were still a family, still whole, still looking forward to ordinary tomorrows. No, I probably couldn't make it to Tommy's game, but I'd try to get the route changed. I told Emma I was proud of her grades, that college was worth the investment, that she should focus on her studies and not worry about working too many hours. The miles rolled by unnoticed as I listened, drawn deeper into this impossible broadcast from a life that existed somewhere beyond the reach of time and law. The radio voices painted a world where Sarah's diagnosis had been a false alarm, where Emma had looked both ways at that intersection, where our family had survived intact, and was simply waiting for me to come home from another long haul. But gradually I began to notice inconsistencies in their conversation. Sarah mentioned preparing for a Christmas that had passed months ago. Tommy talked about high school friends who'd moved away years earlier as if he'd seen them yesterday. Emma discussed movies that hadn't been released when she died, books she'd never had the chance to read. Their voices began to overlap strangely, conversations bleeding into each other in ways that defied logic, as if multiple timelines were broadcasting simultaneously through my truck's ancient radio. The static began creeping back, threading through their words like frost spreading across a windshield. Sarah's voice started cutting out, her sentences fragmenting into meaningless syllables. Tommy's laugh became distorted, stretching and warping until it sounded more like wind howling through empty rooms. Emma's words began running backward, her cheerful chatter reversing into nonsensical sounds that raised goosebumps along my arm. Then, cutting through the deteriorating signal, I heard my own voice, but it wasn't me speaking into the radio or calling out to them from the cab. This was my voice as part of their conversation, responding to questions I hadn't heard, laughing at jokes that hadn't registered. I was apparently there with them, wherever they were, participating in this phantom family dinner, while simultaneously driving alone through the Colorado darkness. If I was there with them in that impossible broadcast, what did that mean for the version of me gripping the steering wheel, staring out at rain-slicked asphalt that seemed to be moving too fast beneath my headlight? The radio voices grew more insistent, calling my name with increasing urgency. They needed me to hurry home, they said. Dinner was getting cold. The game was about to start. Emma had news to share, something important she couldn't wait to tell me. Their voices overlapped and echoed, creating a chorus of familial love and expectation that pulled at something fundamental in my chest. I realized I'd been unconsciously pressing harder on the accelerator, the speedometer climbing past safe limits for these treacherous mountain curves. The rain was coming down in sheets now, and my headlights barely penetrated more than a few yards ahead. Yellow guardrails flashed by like broken teeth, the only thing standing between my 18-wheeler and the 1,000-foot drops that waited beyond the road's edge. The radio static suddenly cleared completely, and Sarah's voice came through with perfect clarity. She was singing the lullaby she used to hum to Emma when she was small, the same melody she'd sometimes sang softly while I drove us home from late dinners out, her head resting against my shoulder as the miles rolled by beneath us. The song wrapped around me like warm arms, and I could almost feel her presence in the passenger seat, could almost catch the faint scent of her perfume mixing with the diesel and rain. But when I glanced to my right, the seat was empty except for shadows and the faint glow of the radio's display. The singing continued, joined now by Emma's younger voice harmonizing in perfect pitch, the way they used to during long car trips when we were all still together, and the future seemed like an endless highway stretching toward distant but reachable horizon. Tommy's voice joined the melody, and suddenly they were all singing together, a choir of impossible love, calling me home through frequencies that shouldn't exist. The song grew louder, drowning out the engine noise and the rain and the rational part of my mind that knew this couldn't be real, that dead voices didn't broadcast through truck radios on lonely mountain highways. I wanted desperately to follow their voices, to find whatever signal they were broadcasting from, and reunite with the family that had been torn away from me by cancer and twisted metal, and the cruel randomness of a universe that took the best parts of life without explanation. The Silent Mile. From Marcus Chen. The fog rolled in like a living thing. That Tuesday night on Highway 287, somewhere between Amarillo and the Oklahoma line. I'd been driving the same route for 15 years, knew every mile marker and rest stop by heart. But this fog was different. It didn't drift or settle the way fog usually does. It moved with purpose, thick as cotton batting and twice as quiet. My Kenworth's headlights barely penetrated 10 feet ahead, turning the world into a cocoon of yellow-tinged gray. The CB radio had been crackling with chatter from other drivers all evening. Warnings about the weather front moving through, jokes about visibility, the usual road talk that keeps you company on these long hauls. But as I pushed deeper into that wall of mist, something strange began to happen. The voices started getting fainter. At first, I figured it was interference from the storm system. Weather can play havoc with radio signals, and I'd experienced plenty of dead zones over the years. But this wasn't like static or signal loss. The voices were just muffled, like someone had wrapped the entire world in thick blankets. I turned up the volume, adjusted the squelch, even switched channels, but every frequency sounded distant and hollow. Then I noticed my engine. A Caterpillar C15 has a particular rumble, a deep bass note that vibrates through your bones after enough hours behind the wheel. It's a sound that becomes part of you, reliable as your own heartbeat. But now, even though I could feel the engine's power beneath me, the sound seemed muted, dampened, as if the fog was somehow absorbing the noise itself. I rolled down my window to get some fresh air and heard something that made my skin crawl. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. No tire hum on asphalt, no wind whistle, no engine noise from my own truck, despite the fact that I was doing 65 miles per hour down a major highway. The silence was so complete, it felt like a physical presence pressing against my eardrums. That's when I started to panic, just a little. I honked my horn, a long blast that should have echoed across the plains, but the sound died immediately, swallowed by the fog before it could travel more than a few feet. It was like being trapped inside a soundproof chamber, except I was moving at highway speed through what should have been open country. I tried the CB again, keying the mic with shaking fingers. Breaker 19, this is Eastbound Express. Anybody got their ears on? My own voice sounded strange, flat and lifeless even inside the cab. The radio didn't even crackle in response. It was as if the fog had severed all connection to the outside world. The mile markers became my only proof that I was still moving forward. They emerged from the gray wall like ghosts, their reflective surfaces catching my headlights for just a moment before disappearing again behind me. Mile 3. At least I was making progress, though toward what I couldn't say. Till was yay. That's when I saw the taillights. 2 red dots floating in the fog ahead, maybe 50 yards out. Another truck, had to be, moving at about the same speed I was. I felt a surge of relief so strong it nearly brought tears to my eyes. I wasn't alone in this weird pocket of silence. I flashed my headlights, the universal trucker greeting, hoping to get a response. The taillights flickered but didn't flash back in the usual pattern. Instead, they seemed to pulse with an odd rhythm, almost like a heartbeat. Slow and steady, on and off, on and off. I followed them for what felt like hours, though my clock seemed to have stopped working properly. The digital display flickered between different times, never settling on anything that made sense. I tried to close the distance between us, pressing the accelerator and feeling the truck respond, but somehow those taillights stayed exactly the same distance ahead. They weren't getting closer or farther away, just maintaining that precise 50-yard gap, no matter how much speed I added. The speedometer showed I was doing 80 now, then 90, speeds that should have been reckless in this visibility, but still those red lights hovered just out of reach. The mile markers had stopped appearing. I should have been seeing 315, 316, 317 by now, but there was nothing but endless gray fog and those pulsing red dots, leading me deeper into the silence. My fuel gauge showed 3/4 full, same as it had when I'd first entered the fog, despite the fact that I'd been driving for what felt like half the night. That's when I realized the taillights weren't taillights at all. Even a lifted pickup or a tall semi would have its lights lower than what I was seeing. And they weren't quite the right color, not the deep red of brake lights or running lights, but something more organic like the glow of heated metal, or eyes. I was following a pair of eyes through this soundless fog, eyes that belonged to something large enough that they'd appear at taillight height from my perspective in the cab. Something that could move at highway speeds while maintaining perfect distance control, something that belonged to this weird pocket of muffled reality I'd stumbled into. I took my foot off the accelerator, letting the truck slow naturally. The Jake brake would have normally roared to life, helping control my speed, but even that mechanical thunder was swallowed by the fog. As my speed dropped, those red lights began to fade, growing dimmer and smaller until they vanished entirely back into the gray. For a moment I was alone again in that terrible silence, but then I heard something that made every muscle in my body tense. Breathing, deep, slow inhalations and exhalations that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The fog itself was breathing, drawing air in and out with the rhythm of a sleeping giant. I fumbled for my cell phone, hoping for any connection to the normal world. The screen was completely black, not even showing the time or battery level. When I pressed the power button, nothing happened. It was as if the device had never existed, had never been anything more than a plastic shell. The breathing grew louder, or maybe closer, though in that soundless gray void, it was impossible to tell direction or distance. It was the only sound in existence, and it filled the cab of my truck with its steady rhythm. In, out, each breath lasting exactly 4 seconds in each direction, perfectly measured and utterly inhuman. But eventually I had to breathe, and when I did, my exhalation seemed to synchronize with the larger rhythm surrounding me. 4 seconds out, 4 seconds in, as if the fog was teaching me its pattern, incorporating me into its system. Not the fear of the unknown or the supernatural, but the creeping suspicion that I might never leave this place, that I might drive forever through this silent gray world, following mysterious lights and matching my breathing to something that shouldn't exist, becoming part of the fog's digestive system as it slowly processed sound and time and reality itself. I floored the accelerator, desperate now to break free. The speedometer climbed past reasonable numbers, past safe numbers, past any numbers I'd ever attempted on a highway, but the fog remained constant around me, the same gray walls, the same suffocating silence. My truck was running at impossible speeds through what felt like motionless air. One moment I was trapped in that gray, soundless world, and the next I was back on normal Highway 287, under a clear star-filled sky. The sudden return of engine noise was so violent it made me cry out. My radio came alive with chatter, voices overlapping, as drivers reported on conditions up ahead, and the normal sounds of wind and tires and mechanical operation flooded back like a dam had burst. Other trucks were parked there, their drivers moving around normally, checking tie-downs and grabbing coffee from the vending machine. I approached one of them, an older driver I'd seen around but never talked to. "Excuse me," I said, my voice still sounding strange to my own ears after that silence. "Did you just come through that fog back there?" He looked at me with confusion. "What fog? It's been clear all night." He gestured toward the highway where my headlights were illuminating perfectly normal asphalt stretching into ordinary darkness. I looked at my logbook. According to the timestamps, I'd lost 6 hours somewhere in that gray void. 6 hours that existed in my memory, but apparently nowhere else in the world. The mirror that never showed the same road twice. From Jake Morrison. The thing about driving long haul is that you spend a lot of time looking in mirrors. Side mirrors, rear view mirror, that little convex one, mounted on the passenger side, that warns you objects are closer than they appear. After 23 years behind the wheel of an 18-wheeler, I thought I knew every reflection those mirrors could show me. Highway stretches that blur into infinity, the occasional tailgater riding too close to my trailer, my own weathered face staring back during those lonely 3 a.m. moments, when the road feels like it goes on forever and nowhere all at once. But the mirror in that old Peterbilt I picked up in Tucson last October, well, that one showed me things that weren't there, or maybe things that were there, just not where I was looking. I should have known something was off the moment I saw the truck sitting on that used lot, pristine as a Sunday morning despite the salesman telling me it was a night. The chrome bumper caught the desert sun like it had been polished that very day, and the deep blue paint job looked factory fresh. Even the interior was immaculate. Black leather seats without a crack, dashboard free of the usual trucker accessories and coffee stain. The only thing that seemed worn was the rearview mirror, its silver backing showing dark spots around the edges like age spots on an old man's hand. My old Kenworth had finally given up the ghost outside Phoenix, and I needed wheels fast to make the delivery deadline. The salesman, a thin man with nervous eyes who kept wiping sweat from his forehead despite the October chill, seemed eager to get the Peterbilt off his lot. Said the previous owner had been particular about maintenance, but decided to retire suddenly, something about the road not agreeing with him anymore. The engine purred with a low, satisfied rumble that seemed to harmonize with the whisper of wind around the cab. The steering was responsive, the brakes firm, and the transmission shifted smooth as silk. I was hauling a load of electronics from Phoenix to Denver, familiar territory I'd covered dozens of times before. Interstate 40 eastbound, then north on 25 through Albuquerque, and Santa Fe, winding through the high desert country where the horizon stretches so far it seems to curve with the earth itself. It was somewhere north of Flagstaff as the sun was settling into that golden hour that makes the landscape look like it's been dipped in honey, that I first noticed something peculiar in the rearview mirror. I was checking my 6, making sure the car that had been pacing me for the last 10 miles wasn't planning anything stupid, when I saw the road behind me wasn't the same road I'd just traveled. Instead of the relatively straight stretch of interstate I knew I'd been driving, the mirror showed a winding mountain road, narrow and tree-lined, with shadows that seemed too deep for the time of day. I blinked hard and looked again, but the image remained stubbornly wrong. The strange road curved away into darkness that looked almost liquid, flowing between pine trees that swayed despite no visible wind. I turned around to look through the rear window of the cab, and there was Interstate 40, exactly as it should be, with that persistent sedan still maintaining its steady distance behind my trailer. But when I looked back at the mirror, the mountain road was still there, and now I could see something moving along it, a shape that might have been another truck but seemed to shift and blur whenever I tried to focus on it directly. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, knuckles going white against the black leather grip. 23 years of driving had taught me to trust my mirrors absolutely. But now, one of them was showing me a lie. Or maybe it was showing me a truth I wasn't ready to understand. The next few hours passed without incident, though I found myself glancing at that rearview mirror more often than I should have. Each time, it showed a different road than the one I was actually traveling. Sometimes it was that narrow mountain path, sometimes a rain-slicked city street lined with buildings that seemed to lean in toward each other, sometimes a desert highway that stretched endlessly under a star-filled sky, even though it was still daylight outside my windshield. As darkness began to settle over the high desert and my headlights carved a tunnel through the growing gloom, the mirror's lies became more disturbing. Instead of the red taillights of traffic ahead of me, it showed empty road stretching back into absolute blackness. But it wasn't the normal darkness of night on a rural highway. This was darkness with weight, darkness that seemed to press against the glass from the other side. The place was one of those all-night havens truckers know by heart, fluorescent lights buzzing over islands of gas pumps, a diner with red vinyl booths and coffee that could wake the dead. I parked between two other big rigs and sat for a moment, engine ticking as it cooled, trying to convince myself that fatigue was playing tricks on my eyes. It showed the interior of my cab, as it should, but I wasn't in the driver's seat. Instead, there was a figure I didn't recognize, someone wearing the same style jacket I had on, but whose face was turned away, hands gripping the wheel with an intensity that spoke of desperation or fear. I ran back around to the driver's side and climbed up. The cab was empty except for me, and when I adjusted the mirror to look at my own reflection, I saw my familiar face staring back, older than I like to admit, but definitely mine. Yet something in my reflected eyes looked different, haunted in a way that made my skin prickle with unease. The coffee in the diner tasted like burned tar, and the fluorescent lights flickered with an irregular rhythm that made my head ache. The other drivers seemed normal enough, talking about weather and load schedules and the usual road gossip, but I felt disconnected from their conversations, as if I was listening to them through thick glass. The waitress, a motherly woman with kind eyes, asked if I was feeling all right, said I looked like I'd seen a ghost. Maybe I had. Take back on the road, climbing through the mountains toward Santa Fe, the mirror's deceptions grew more elaborate. It began showing me scenes that seemed almost like memories, but not quite right. I saw myself driving different trucks down roads I'd never traveled, through landscapes that felt familiar yet impossible. Desert highways that wound through forests, city streets that ended abruptly at ocean cliffs, mountain passes that led into underground tunnels lit by an amber glow that had no visible source. Sometimes older, sometimes younger, but always with something changed about my expression, my posture, the way I held my shoulders, as if the mirror was showing me versions of myself that had made different choices, taken different roads, ended up in different places entirely. It was past midnight when I saw the other truck for the first time, really saw it, not just as a blurred shape in those impossible reflected roads, but as a clear image that made my blood run cold. It was a Peterbilt identical to the one I was driving, same deep blue paint, same chrome fixtures, but there was something wrong with it that I couldn't quite identify. It seemed to flicker slightly, like a bad television signal, and the driver was someone who looked exactly like me but whose movements were just slightly out of sync with my own. When I raised my hand to adjust the mirror, the reflected driver raised his hand a fraction of a second too late. When I turned my head to check the passenger side mirror, he turned his head a fraction too far. It was like watching a badly dubbed movie where the audio doesn't quite match the actor's lip. The highway ahead was empty, a ribbon of asphalt unwinding through the dark mountains, but the mirror showed that other truck getting closer, mile by mile, until I could see details that shouldn't have been visible. The other driver's face was my face, but worn by experiences I'd never had, marked by roads I'd never traveled. His eyes held a desperate intensity that made me understand why the previous owner of this truck had decided to retire so suddenly. I tried adjusting the mirror, thinking maybe a loose connection was causing some kind of optical illusion, but the image remained stubbornly clear. The other truck was gaining on me, and I realized with a chill that ran down my spine like ice water, that it wasn't following me along some reflected road. It was trying to catch up to me, trying to merge with my reality. The engine noise began to change, taking on harmonics that didn't belong to any diesel I'd ever heard. It was still the familiar rumble of a Peterbilt engine, but underneath was something else, a sound like distant thunder or maybe like another engine running just slightly out of phase. The curtain call. From Marcus. The interstate stretched ahead like a black ribbon under the star-drunk sky, and I was making good time through Nevada when I first noticed the truck stop's neon sign flickering against the desert darkness. The moonlight rest, it proclaimed in faded blue cursive, with a crescent moon that buzzed and sparked every few seconds. My 18-wheeler's diesel engine had been running smooth for the past 600 miles, but the fuel gauge was nudging toward empty, and my logbook demanded I take a break soon. The digital clock on my dashboard read 2:47 a.m., as I guided my rig past a handful of other trucks parked in the shadows beyond the main building. The moonlight rest looked like it had been plucked from another decade and dropped onto this lonely stretch of highway. White stucco walls reflected the neon glow, and large windows promised warmth and coffee inside. What caught my attention, though, were the curtains. Every window in the place was fitted with heavy dark curtains that seemed to move ever so slightly, as if stirred by some unseen presence within. I'd been driving these routes for 15 years, and I'd learned to trust my instincts about truck stops. This place felt different, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. The parking lot crunched under my boots as I walked toward the entrance. Gravel scattered across cracked asphalt that had seen better days. The air carried that peculiar desert smell of sage and dust, tinged with the ever-present aroma of diesel fuel. Above me, the neon moon continued its erratic dance, casting shifting shadows across the ground. Through the windows I could make out the typical truck stop interior. A few tables, a counter with coffee pots, and racks of snacks and sundries, but those curtains kept drawing my eye. They hung perfectly still now, heavy fabric that looked almost theatrical in its richness. A bell chimed softly as I pushed through the glass door, and immediately I was enveloped by the familiar sounds of late-night truck stop life. Coffee percolated behind the counter. A radio played country music at low volume, and somewhere in the back, a refrigerator hummed steadily. The clerk behind the counter was a thin man with silver hair and kind eyes that crinkled when he smiled. His name tag read, Eli, and he nodded as I approached. "Evening, driver," Eli said, his voice carrying a slight rasp that spoke of too many late nights and cigarettes. "Coffee's fresh and I've got hot sandwiches if you're hungry. What can I get you?" I ordered coffee and a ham sandwich, taking a moment to study the interior while Eli worked behind the counter. The place was clean and well maintained, with checkered linoleum floors and walls decorated with vintage trucking memorabilia. But those curtains dominated every window, drawn tight against the desert night. They appeared to be made of heavy velvet in a deep burgundy color, and they hung with perfect precision, not a fold out of place. "Interesting curtains," I commented as Eli handed me my coffee in a ceramic mug that was pleasantly warm against my palms. Eli's smile flickered for just a moment. "Previous owner installed those. Said they helped with the desert sun during the day, kept the place cool. I've never bothered to change them." He paused, wiping down the counter with a dish towel. "Though I'll admit, sometimes I wonder what possessed someone to hang such fancy curtains in a truck stop." I settled at a table near the window, close enough to one of the curtain panes to see the fabric up close. The weave was incredibly fine, and the color seemed to shift subtly in the fluorescent lighting. As I sipped my coffee and unwrapped my sandwich, I became aware of a subtle presence, as if someone was standing just behind the curtain, watching. The feeling was so strong that I found myself staring at the heavy fabric, waiting for some sign of movement or disturbance. "You're not the first to notice them," Eli said from behind the counter, his voice carrying across the quiet space. "Drivers sometimes comment on the curtain. Some folks find them unsettling." The way he said unsettling made me look up from my sandwich. Eli was watching me with an expression that seemed carefully neutral, but his eyes held something I couldn't quite read. Outside, the wind had picked up, and I could hear it whistling around the building's corners, but the curtains remained absolutely still. Eli was quiet for a long moment, his hands continuing to move the dish towel in slow circles across the already clean counter. "Can't say as I have," he finally replied. "Sometimes it's better to leave things as they are, don't you?" As the minutes passed, my unease grew rather than diminished. The coffee was good, the sandwich satisfying, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being observed. Not by Eli, who had busied himself with organizing inventory behind the counter, but by someone or something positioned just beyond my line of sight. The sensation was most intense near the window, where the burgundy curtain hung like a barrier between the interior and whatever lay beyond. I finished my meal and approached the counter to pay, but as I reached for my wallet, a sound stopped me cold. It was barely audible above the ambient noise of the truck stop, but unmistakable once I focused on it, the soft whisper of fabric brushing against glass. I turned toward the window where I'd been sitting, and my breath caught in my throat. The curtain was moving, just slightly, as if someone on the other side was pressing against it, trying to peer through the gap where the two panels met. "Eli," I said quietly, not taking my eyes off the curtain, "there's someone outside your window." When I glanced back at the counter, Eli had gone very still, his hands frozen in the middle of counting change. His face had taken on a pale, waxy quality under the fluorescent lights. "That's not possible," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "The windows are 15 feet off the ground on that side. The building's built into a slope." The curtain moved again, more distinctly this time, bulging inward as if someone was pressing their face against the glass from the outside. But if Eli was right about the height, no one could be standing out there unless they were impossibly tall or somehow suspended in midair. I approached the window slowly, my heart beginning to race despite my attempts to rationalize what I was seeing. "I wouldn't," Eli said sharply from behind me. "I really wouldn't if I were you." But curiosity and 15 years of trucking had taught me that most mysteries have mundane explanations. I reached for the edge of the curtain, intending to pull it aside just enough to see what was causing the disturbance. The moment my fingers touched the velvet fabric, a wave of cold shot up my arm, so intense it felt like I'd grabbed a handful of snow. The material seemed to pulse under my touch, as if it was alive, and the bulge on the other side pressed more insistently against the glass. Through the fabric, I could feel the outline of what seemed to be a human face, but wrong somehow, distorted in ways that my mind struggled to process. The features were too angular, the proportions stretched beyond normal human dimension. Whatever was pressing against the window from the impossible vantage point outside was not entirely human, and it was aware that I was touching the curtain. I jerked my hand back as if I'd been burned, and immediately the curtain fell still again, hanging in perfect innocent fold. But the cold sensation lingered in my fingers, and I could swear I heard something like a sigh emanating from behind the fabric, though it might have been the wind outside. He had moved closer, and his face showed a mixture of sympathy and resignation. "They're not really curtains, not anymore, haven't been for a long time." "What are you talking about?" I demanded, though part of me already suspected I didn't want to know the answer. Eli gestured toward all the windows, where identical burgundy curtains hung in perfect stillness. The previous owner, his name was Carlton Reese. He was obsessed with theater, spent his whole life working as a stagehand in Reno before he bought this place. When he put up those curtains, he said he wanted to give drivers a sense of drama, a little theatrical flair in the middle of nowhere. The old man paused, looking around the truck stop with tired eyes. "Carlton died about 3 years ago, right here in this room. Heart attack, middle of the night shift. Found him the next morning, slumped over behind the counter. But before he died, he spent months talking about how the curtains were special, how they were like a barrier between the performance and the audience." The Bone Freight Express. From Marcus Holloway. The thing about driving freight is that you learn not to ask too many questions about what you're hauling, especially when the pay is triple your usual rate, and the pickup location is some forgotten industrial district where the streetlights gave up working years ago. I've been running long-haul routes for 15 years now, my Peterbilt 37.9 and I covering every mile of asphalt from Maine to California, and I thought I'd seen every kind of cargo manifest that existed. Medical supplies, construction materials, even government contracts with those mysterious black stamps that make you sign extra paperwork. But when I pulled into the loading dock at Meridian Biologics that cold October night, something felt different from the moment I stepped out of my cab. The facility looked more like an abandoned warehouse than any legitimate shipping company I'd worked with before. Sodium vapor lights cast everything in that sickly yellow glow that makes even healthy people look like they're dying, and the only sound besides my engine's idle was the distant hum of refrigeration units somewhere deep in the building. The loading supervisor who met me was a thin man with pale skin and eyes that seemed to look right through me when he spoke. He handed me a clipboard with the standard forms, but when I glanced at the cargo description, all it said was biological research materials, refrigerated transport required. The paperwork showed my destination as a research facility outside Denver, a straight shot west on Interstate 80, that would take me through some of the loneliest stretches of highway in the country. The supervisor watched me sign with an intensity that made my skin crawl, and when I asked about the exact nature of the cargo for my own safety protocols, he simply repeated what was written on the manifest. Biological research materials, temperature controlled, handle with extreme care. The pay was good enough that I swallowed my questions and backed my trailer up to Dock 7. Where a team of workers in white coveralls began loading sealed metal containers that looked more like oversized coffins than shipping crates. Each container was maybe 7 feet long and 3 feet wide, stainless steel with heavy-duty latches and biohazard symbols, stenciled in red along the sides. They moved them with mechanical precision, using forklifts and dollies, never making unnecessary noise or conversation. I counted 12 containers in total as they secured them in my refrigerated trailer, each one making a soft thudding sound when it was set down that seemed to echo longer than it should have. The loading supervisor checked my refrigeration unit twice, making sure the temperature was set to exactly 34 degrees Fahrenheit, just above freezing. Cold enough to preserve, he said, warm enough to prevent damage to the specimen. I pulled away from Meridian Biologics just after midnight, my trailer loaded heavy and my refrigeration unit humming steadily behind me. The route would take me through Nebraska farmland, past endless fields of harvested corn that stood like stubble in the moonlight, then up into Colorado where the highway cuts through mountains that seemed to swallow sound and light equally. I settled into my usual driving rhythm, the diesel engine's steady rumble and the soft whisper of air brakes, creating the familiar soundtrack of the road. But something felt off about this particular run from the very beginning. Maybe it was the weight distribution in my trailer, which seemed to shift slightly every time I took a curve, as if the cargo wasn't properly secured despite what I'd watched the loading crew do. Or maybe it was the way my refrigeration unit seemed to be working harder than usual, cycling on and off more frequently than it should have with a stable load. But what really started to bother me was the smell that began creeping into my cab somewhere around Grand Island, Nebraska, a faint odor that seemed to seep through the air vents despite the sealed trailer behind me. It wasn't the usual smell of refrigerated transport, that clean chemical coldness you get from properly maintained cooling systems. This was something organic and earthy, like soil that had been disturbed after lying undisturbed for a very long time. At first I thought maybe it was just my imagination, or perhaps something I'd picked up on my boots at the loading dock, but as the miles rolled by and the smell grew stronger, I knew it was coming from somewhere in my trailer. I checked my temperature gauges obsessively, making sure the refrigeration was working properly, but everything showed normal readings even as that strange earthy scent continued to intensify. The radio chatter from other drivers gradually faded as I moved into the less traveled sections of highway, leaving me alone with my thoughts and that increasingly troublesome smell. I tried rolling down my windows to get fresh air, but the October wind was bitter cold and did nothing to clear the odor that seemed to have settled permanently in my nostril. By the time I reached the Colorado border, I was beginning to feel genuinely unsettled, not just by the smell but by a growing sense that something was actively wrong with my cargo. The scale operator, a grizzled man who'd probably been checking truck weights since before I was born, gave me an odd look when my trailer registered on his equipment. He walked around my rig twice, checking my permit numbers and cargo manifest, then asked me to step on the scale a second time. When the same reading came up, he scratched his head and muttered something about inconsistent weight distribution, but he waved me through without any real explanation of what had caught his attention. I didn't think much of it at the time, but as I pulled back onto the highway and began the gradual climb into Colorado's higher elevations, I started paying closer attention to how my trailer was handling. The weight seemed to shift more dramatically now during turns and lane changes, not like loose cargo sliding around, but like something inside the containers was moving independently of the truck's motion. It was subtle at first, just a slight pull to one side or the other that I could correct with steering input, but as the night wore on and the highway wound higher into the mountains, the shifting became more pronounced and harder to predict. The real trouble started when I pulled into a rest area outside Lemon to check my load and grab some coffee. The parking lot was empty except for a couple of cars near the restrooms, and my footsteps echoed strangely in the thin mountain air as I walked back to inspect my trailer. The refrigeration unit was running normally, maintaining the required temperature, but the smell was now so strong that I could taste it in the back of my throat. I walked along the side of my trailer, checking the door seals and latches, and that's when I heard the sound that made my blood run cold. I stopped breathing and pressed my ear to the cold steel wall, and the sound became clearer, definitely originating from somewhere among my cargo containers. Scratching and what might have been a faint tapping, as if something inside those sealed metal boxes was trying to get out. I told myself it had to be thermal expansion, metal contracting in the cold, or maybe some kind of settling, as the refrigeration affected whatever materials were packed with the biological specimen. But as I stood there in the empty rest area with mountain wind whistling through the pine trees, listening to those sounds continue with unnatural regularity, I couldn't shake the feeling that something inside my trailer was very much alive. The scratching would pause for a few seconds, then resume with what seemed like deliberate intent, moving from one section of the trailer to another, as if whatever was making it was testing different points along the wall. I grabbed my flashlight and circuited the entire trailer, checking every latch and seal, but everything appeared secure from the outside. When I climbed back into my cab and resumed driving, the shifting weight problem became severe enough that I had to reduce my speed and avoid sudden maneuvers. Whatever was happening in those containers was getting worse, and the scratching sounds were now audible even over my engine noise and road vibration. I tried turning up my radio to drown out the noise, but it seemed to follow me, persistent and increasingly urgent, as if something back there was running out of time. The final stretch of highway into Denver took me through a series of mountain passes where cell phone coverage disappeared, and the only lights were my own headlights cutting through the darkness. The scratching had evolved into what sounded unmistakably like knocking, deliberate and rhythmic, coming from multiple containers now instead of just one. My trailer was swaying enough during turns that I had to grip my steering wheel with both hands and fight to keep my rig in its lane, and the smell had become so overwhelming that I was breathing through my mouth to avoid gagging. It was just past 4 in the morning when I saw lights ahead that marked my destination, a modern research complex built into a hillside outside Denver. But as I began my descent toward the facility, something happened that made me question everything I thought I knew about my cargo. The knocking stopped abruptly, all at once, as if whatever was making it had suddenly sensed our arrival. My trailer stabilized immediately, the weight distribution returning to normal so quickly that I almost oversteered in compensation. The weeping diesel. From Marcus. Sight guy. I heard my Peterbilt cry. I was hauling a load of refrigerated pharmaceuticals through the Oregon mountains on a Tuesday night in late October. 23 years on the road had taught me to recognize every sound a truck could make, from the satisfied purr of a well-tuned engine to the death rattle of failing bearings. But this sound, this low, keening wail that seemed to emanate from somewhere deep within the engine compartment, was unlike anything I'd ever encountered. It started as we climbed the grade outside of Medford, the headlights cutting through a light drizzle that had been falling since sundown. The CB radio crackled with the usual chatter of drivers warning about speed traps and weather conditions ahead, but underneath it all, barely audible at first, came that strange, mournful sound. I reached over and turned down the radio, straining to listen. There it was again, a soft sobbing that seemed to rise and fall with the rhythm of the diesel engine, as if the truck itself were in some kind of distress. I pulled over at the next rest stop, a lonely stretch of asphalt carved out of the pine forest, with nothing but a few picnic tables and a rusted trash barrel. The rain had intensified, drumming against the cab roof with a steady percussion that usually helped me sleep, but tonight only seemed to amplify my unease. I grabbed my flashlight and climbed down from the cab, the cold mountain air immediately penetrating my jacket. Walking around to the front of the truck, I popped the hood and shone the light into the engine compartment. Everything looked normal. The massive Caterpillar engine sitting there like a sleeping giant, all belts and hoses in their proper places. I let the engine idle while I listened, and there it was again, that heart-wrenching sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't mechanical, I was certain of that. Mechanical problems had their own vocabulary of squeals and grinding noise. This was something else entirely, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up despite the rational part of my mind insisting that engines don't cry. The GPS showed another 140 miles to my delivery point in Portland, and I had a schedule to keep. Whatever was causing that sound, it wasn't affecting the truck's performance. The engine temperature was normal, Oil pressure was good, and we were making good time despite the weather. I pulled back onto the highway and tried to focus on the road ahead, but the crying continued, sometimes barely a whisper, sometimes growing so loud it seemed to drown out the rumble of the diesel engine itself. The paperwork said pharmaceuticals, but it was more specific than that. These were experimental drugs, something to do with pediatric oncology according to the manifest. Children's cancer medications, heading to a research hospital in Portland. The thought of sick children made my chest tight, and for a moment I wondered if that was somehow connected to the sounds my truck was making. But that was ridiculous, I told myself. Trucks don't have feelings, don't respond to their cargo with anything resembling emotion. The crying grew worse as I descended into the Willamette Valley, the sound becoming more distinct, more human-like. It reminded me of my nephew Tommy when he was little, the way he would cry in the middle of the night when he was staying at our house. My wife Sarah would always hear him first. Her maternal instincts, finely tuned, even to borrowed children. She'd go to his room and sit with him until the bad dreams passed, humming old lullabies her grandmother had taught her. Sarah had been gone 3 years now, taken by the same disease that these medicines in my trailer were designed to fight. The truck's crying seemed to intensify, as if it could sense my emotional state, feeding off my grief, like some kind of mechanical parasite. The sound was definitely coming through the floorboards now, vibrating up through the frame, and into my bone. I could feel it as much as hear it, a resonance that seemed to sync with my own heartbeat. At a truck stop outside of Salem, I tried calling my mechanic back home, but he just listened to my description, with the patience of someone humoring an old friend who's been on the road too long. Probably just a belt starting to slip, he said, his voice tinny through the hands-free speaker. Or maybe something with the turbo. Bring her in when you get back, and I'll take a look. But I could hear the skepticism in his voice. He thought I was losing my mind, and maybe I was. The final stretch into Portland took me through increasingly urban areas, the pine forests giving way to suburbs and industrial districts. The rain had stopped, but a heavy fog had rolled in from the Columbia River, reducing visibility to just a few dozen yards. The truck's headlights seemed to barely penetrate the gray wall that surrounded us, and the crying had now become a constant accompaniment to our journey, a lament that rose and fell like a funeral dirge. I was relieved when I finally reached the hospital complex, a sprawling medical campus that sprawled across several city blocks. The loading dock was well lit and staffed even at this late hour, with technicians in white coats waiting to process my temperature-sensitive cargo. As I backed up to the dock, however, something strange happened. The crying stopped, completely. The sudden silence was almost more unsettling than the sound had been, leaving me feeling oddly empty, as if something important had been taken away. The unloading process went smoothly, with the medical team efficiently transferring the insulated containers from my trailer to their own refrigerated storage units. One of the technicians, a young woman with kind eyes, struck up a conversation while the paperwork was being processed. "This batch is particularly important," she said, checking the serial numbers against her clipboard. "We've got 12 children in the trial program, and their families have been waiting months for these specific compounds." As she spoke, I heard it again, faint but unmistakable, the sound of crying. But this time, it wasn't coming from my truck. It was coming from somewhere inside the hospital itself, drifting out through the loading dock's open doors. Not mechanical crying this time, but real human weeping, the sound of parents keeping vigil, of children facing battles no child should have to fight. The technician noticed my expression and followed my gaze toward the hospital interior. "The pediatric oncology ward," she explained quietly. "It's hard sometimes, especially during the night shift, but what we're doing here, what you're helping us do by bringing these medicines, it's making a difference. Last month we had our first complete remission, using the previous formula. A little girl named Emma, only 6 years old. She got to go home to her family. As we finished the paperwork and I prepared to leave, I found myself looking back at my truck with new understanding. The Peterbilt sat there in the loading dock's harsh fluorescent light, looking like just another piece of machinery, all chrome and steel and practical purpose. But I knew better now. Somehow, in ways I couldn't explain or even fully comprehend, my truck had been responding to its cargo, feeling the weight of hope and desperation that rode with those medicines. The drive back was quiet, my empty trailer riding light behind me. As I headed north toward home, the fog was beginning to lift, revealing glimpses of the Columbia River and the mountains beyond. My truck ran smoothly, its engine humming with the satisfied sound of a job well done. No more crying, no more mysterious sounds from the engine compartment. But as I crested the hill overlooking the river, I could have sworn I heard something else. Not crying this time, but something that sounded almost like relief, like a long-held breath finally being released. I rolled down my window and let the cool morning air wash over my face, carrying with it the scent of rain and pine trees and the promise of home. As I was doing my pre-trip inspection, checking the reefer unit and securing the load, I heard it again, that soft, heartbroken crying that seemed to come from the very soul of the machine. But this time, instead of fear or confusion, I felt something else, understanding, maybe even compassion. "I know, girl," I said, patting the truck's fender, like you might comfort a friend. "I know exactly how you feel." The crying continued as we pulled out of the depot and onto the highway. But somehow it didn't seem quite so lonely anymore. We had a job to do, my truck and I, carrying hope through the darkness toward children who needed miracles. And if that meant listening to an engine's tears for a few hundred miles, well, that seemed like a small price to pay. The parallel path. From Marquesas, the stretch of Interstate 40 between Flagstaff and Albuquerque has always been my favorite run, especially during those quiet hours when the desert spreads endless and dark on both sides of the asphalt. My Peterbilt 37.9 hums like a contented beast, her chrome catching the occasional flash of distant lightning from storms that never seemed to reach the highway. Tonight was supposed to be like any other crossing through this moonlit wasteland, but somewhere around mile marker 2067, I noticed him. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The dashboard clock read 2:47 a.m., and I'd been driving since sunset, hauling a load of furniture from Phoenix to Little Rock. The caffeine from my last truck stop coffee had worn thin, leaving me in that familiar state of highway hypnosis, where the yellow lines blur into one continuous ribbon, pulling you forward through the darkness. That's when I saw the movement in my peripheral vision, something keeping pace with my rig along the shoulder of the road. I adjusted my side mirror and caught a glimpse of what looked like a man, but not walking or running as you'd expect. He was crawling on his hands and knees, moving with an unnatural fluidity that somehow matched my 55-mile-per-hour cruising speed. His clothes appeared to be some kind of dark coveralls, and his head hung low as if he were following a scent trail. The sight sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the desert's nighttime cold. Road emergencies happen all the time out here, and we truckers look out for each other and anyone else who might be stranded in this unforgiving landscape. But as I eased off the accelerator, the crawling figure matched my speed perfectly, never falling behind or pulling ahead. When I pressed the gas pedal again, resuming my original pace, he adjusted accordingly, maintaining that impossible parallel course along the gravel shoulder. Breaker 19. This is Desert Dog eastbound on 40 at mile 20. Anyone else seeing anything strange out here tonight? I waded through the white noise, hoping another driver would respond, but the airwaves remained stubbornly silent, except for the occasional burst of atmospheric interference. The landscape outside remained unchanged, an endless procession of scrub brush and distant messes silhouetted against a star-crowded sky. No other vehicle shared the highway in either direction, leaving me alone with the steady drone of my diesel engine and the increasingly disturbing presence keeping pace outside my passenger window. I tried switching lanes, moving from the right to the left side of the interstate, but when I checked my mirrors, the crawling man had somehow crossed to the median strip without missing a beat in his strange locomotion. He moved through the tall grass there with the same fluid precision, his dark form barely visible but undeniably present. The sight made my hands grip the steering wheel tighter, and I felt sweat beginning to bead on my forehead despite the cool night air flowing through my cab. The radio finally crackled to life with a voice I didn't recognize, thick with a southern accent and heavy with static. "That you asking about something strange near mile 26.7, good buddy?" I nearly jumped at the unexpected response, quickly keying the mic to reply. "That's a Roger, stranger. You seeing what I'm seeing out here?" A long pause filled with electronic snow preceded his answer. "Been driving this route for 15 years, friend. Every now and then, usually on nights like this when the desert's holding its breath, folks report a crawler keeping pace. Most drivers just keep on trucking and don't talk about it afterward." The transmission ended with a harsh burst of static that made me wince and adjust the volume. I wanted to ask more questions, to understand what this other driver knew about my situation, but when I tried to raise him again, the CB remained dead silent. The isolation felt heavier now, pressing down on me like a physical weight. Outside my window, the desert stretched away into darkness, so complete it seemed to swallow light itself. Only the ribbon of asphalt ahead, illuminated by my headlights, provided any sense of direction or purpose. The crawling figure had moved again, somehow positioning himself directly in front of my truck, but staying just outside the reach of my headlight beams. I could make out his silhouette against the pale concrete, hands and knees touching the road surface in a rhythm that shouldn't have been possible at highway speeds. Occasionally what looked like his head would turn slightly in my direction, though I couldn't make out any facial features in the darkness. My fuel gauge showed 3/4 full, which meant I could continue for several more hours without stopping. But the thought of maintaining this bizarre convoy until dawn filled me with growing dread. I reached for my cell phone, thinking maybe I could call the state police, but the screen showed no signal bars. Out here in the desert's heart, cellular towers were few and far between, leaving drivers dependent on CB radios for communication. A new sound began to intrude on the steady rumble of my engine, a scraping noise that seemed to come from directly ahead. It reminded me of fingernails dragging across concrete, but amplified and continuous. The crawling man's hands appeared to be leaving marks on the asphalt, thin dark lines that caught my headlights' glare. The sight made my stomach clench with an inexplicable sense of wrongness. I decided to test something, and gradually increased my speed, pushing the Peterbilt up to 60, then 65 miles per hour. The scraping sound grew louder and more frantic, but my companion maintained his position with that same impossible precision. His movements became more aggressive, hands and knees striking the pavement with enough force that I could hear the impacts over my engine noise. Sparks began to fly from where his hands touched the road, as if he wore metal gloves against the asphalt. The speedometer climbed past 70, faster than I'd normally drive with a full load, but desperation was overriding caution. The crawling figure's pace increased accordingly, and now I could see that his hands were definitely leaving gouges in the road surface. The sparks coming from his contact with the pavement grew brighter, creating brief flashes that illuminated his form more clearly than I wanted to see. His coveralls were torn and blackened, as if burned or stained with something dark and oily. What struck me most disturbing was the way his limbs moved, with joints that seemed to bend at angles human anatomy shouldn't allow. When his head turned toward my truck, I caught a glimpse of what might have been eyes, reflecting my headlights like an animal's would, twin points of cold light in a face I couldn't quite make out. The scraping noise suddenly stopped, and for a moment I thought he'd fallen behind or given up his pursuit. Relief flooded through me as I checked my mirrors and saw only empty highway stretching back into the darkness. I began to slow down to a more reasonable speed, thinking whatever strange encounter I'd experienced was finally over. The metallic clanking and scraping came from directly behind my cab, as if someone was pulling themselves up the back of my sleeper compartment. My truck's suspension shifted slightly under what felt like additional weight, and I could hear fingernails or claws finding purchase on the aluminum siding of my trailer. The CB radio burst to life with that same southern accented voice from earlier, but now the words were barely comprehensible through waves of static and interference. He can only follow alongside, but if you stop, the rest dissolved into electronic chaos that hurt my ears. I pressed the accelerator harder, pushing my speed back up past 75, hoping the increased wind resistance might make it harder for whatever was back there to maintain its grip. The effort seemed to work somewhat as the metallic scraping became more intermittent and desperate. An exit sign appeared in my headlights, advertising a truck stop just 2 miles ahead. The thought of pulling into a well-lit parking area filled with other drivers seemed like salvation, but the CB warning echoed in my mind. I couldn't risk stopping if it might make the situation worse. Couldn't chance exposing other people to whatever was attached to my truck. I watched my mirrors intently, but couldn't see anything following on the road behind me. The truck stop's neon signs grew larger ahead, promising fuel, food, and most importantly, human company. Still, I maintained my speed and passed the exit without slowing, unwilling to take any chances. Miles continued rolling under my wheels as the night gradually began to give way to the first hints of dawn on the eastern horizon. The station that remembers. From Marcus E. The first time I saw Buddy's Stop and Go, I thought nothing of it. Just another roadside beacon in the endless stretch of Highway 89, somewhere between Flagstaff and nowhere. The neon sign buzzed and flickered against the desert darkness, casting sickly yellow light across the cracked asphalt, where my Peterbilt came to rest with a satisfied diesel sigh. It was 3:17 in the morning, and I'd been driving for 11 hours straight, hauling a load of furniture from Phoenix to Denver. My eyes felt like sandpaper, and the coffee from my last stop had long since worn off. The place looked tired, the kind of tired that settles into a building's bones after decades of serving travelers who never stay long enough to care about its condition. The overhead canopy sagged slightly, and one of the fluorescent tubes underneath buzzed intermittently, creating a strobe effect that made everything feel slightly unreal. But the diesel pumps were clearly marked, and that was all that mattered to a trucker running on fumes and determination. Inside, the station was brighter than it had any right to be at this hour. Every fluorescent light blazed overhead, creating harsh shadows behind the candy displays and magazine racks. The clerk behind the counter was a thin man with graying hair and eyes that seemed to take in more than they should. He nodded as I entered, the electronic chime announcing my arrival with a cheerful ding that felt oddly out of place in the sterile atmosphere. I grabbed 2 energy drinks from the cooler and a bag of trail mix, standard road fuel for the long hauls. The clerk rang me up without comment, his movements efficient and practiced. When I handed him my credit card, his fingers brushed mine for just a moment, and I felt an odd chill despite the warmth of the heated interior. He smiled then, a perfectly normal smile that somehow made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Drive safe out there, Marcus," he said, handing me the receipt. "Roads can be tricky this time of night. I took the receipt and thanked him, but something nagged at me as I walked back to my truck. It wasn't until I was back on the highway, the station's lights fading in my mirrors, that I realized what bothered me. I hadn't given him my name, and my credit card only showed my last initial. Yet he'd known to call me Marcus, said it like he'd known me for years. The second time I encountered Buddy's Stop and Go was 3 weeks later, on a different route entirely. I was running a load of electronics from Salt Lake City to Albuquerque, taking Highway 6 through the emptiness of central Utah. The landscape here was different from Arizona, more desolate somehow, with red rock formations jutting up like sleeping giants against the starlit sky. But there it was again, that familiar yellow glow cutting through the darkness, the same weathered sign announcing Buddy's Stop and Go in faded letters. The station I'd stopped at weeks ago had been in Arizona, at least 200 miles south of here. Yet everything looked identical, from the sagging canopy to the flickering fluorescent tube that created its manic strobe effect across the empty lot. Even the placement of the diesel pumps was exactly the same. The same clerk stood behind the counter when I walked inside, wearing the same polo shirt that might have once been blue, but had faded to an indeterminate gray. He looked up as the electronic chime announced my entrance, and that same unsettling smile spread across his face. "Back again, Marcus," he said, as if no time had passed at all. "How's the road been treating you?" He moved with the same practiced efficiency, but there was something else now, something that felt rehearsed rather than natural. When he handed me my receipt, I made sure to look at his name tag, a plastic rectangle that simply read "Clerk" in block letters where a name should have been. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "Weren't you working at a station down in Arizona a few weeks back?" His smile never wavered, but something shifted behind his eyes, like clouds moving across the moon. "I've been working here for quite some time, Marcus. Maybe you're thinking of someone else." He left without pressing the issue, but sleep didn't come easily that night at the truck stop in Moab. I kept thinking about the impossibility of it all, trying to rationalize what couldn't be rationalized. Maybe all these desert gas stations just looked alike. Maybe all-night clerks developed the same tired, knowing expression. Maybe I was just more exhausted than I'd realized. But deep down, I knew better. The third encounter happened only a week later, and this time I was ready for it. I was running a short haul from Denver to Grand Junction, a road I'd driven hundreds of times. I knew every mile marker, every exit, every place where the road curved just enough to make you pay attention. There had never been a gas station at mile marker 1, where the highway cut through a particularly desolate stretch of Colorado Plateau. Yet there it was, materializing out of the darkness like something from a fever dream. Buddy's Stop and Go, identical in every detail to its previous incarnations. The same flickering light, the same sagging canopy, the same sense of wrongness that made my skin crawl. But this time, I was prepared. I had my phone ready to take pictures, to document whatever impossible thing was happening to me. The photos came out wrong, not completely wrong, but subtly off, as if the camera couldn't quite focus on what it was seeing. The building looked faded in the images, translucent, like a double exposure or a reflection in water. The lights appeared as streaks of color rather than steady illumination, and the clerk behind the counter was nothing more than a blur of shadow and suggestion. But he was real enough when I walked inside, real enough to smile that unsettling smile and ask about my route, as if we were old friends catching up. Real enough to know that I was carrying auto parts this time, though I hadn't told. Real enough to hand me my receipt with those cold fingers and wish me well on the rest of my journey. "See you soon, Marcus," he said as I left, and something in his tone made it sound less like a pleasantry and more like a promise. Over the following months, Buddy's Stop and Go began appearing with increasing frequency. Sometimes it would be there when logic said it shouldn't exist, popping up on routes I'd driven for years without ever seeing it before. Other times I would actively look for it and find only empty desert, as if the station existed only when it chose to be found. The clerk would greet me by name, ask about my cargo or my destination, make small talk that revealed knowledge he shouldn't possess. He began referencing previous conversations, bringing up details from stops I'd made weeks or even months earlier. When I mentioned my daughter's graduation, he asked about it the next time I saw him, though I'd never told him I had a daughter. I started asking other drivers about it, carefully probing to see if anyone else had encountered the impossible station. Most looked at me like I was losing my mind, but a few got a distant look in their eyes, as if remembering something they'd tried to forget. One old-timer named Red finally admitted he'd seen something similar, though he was reluctant to talk about it. "Some places on the road ain't meant for us," he said, staring into his coffee cup at a truck stop in Amarillo. "But they find us anyway. Best thing you can do is keep driving and hope they lose interest." If anything, it was becoming more persistent, more real. The clerk began offering unsolicited advice about my loads, my routes, even my personal life. He suggested I take Highway 50 instead of I-70, to avoid a way station closure I wouldn't learn about until hours later. He recommended I call my ex-wife because she was thinking about me, and when I finally worked up the nerve to do so, she mentioned she'd been wanting to talk. The helpful nature of these interactions only made them more disturbing. It would have been easier to dismiss the whole experience if the clerk had been malevolent or threatening. Instead, he seemed genuinely concerned for my welfare, like a guardian angel with too much knowledge and not enough substance. The breaking point came on a foggy night in November, somewhere in the Nevada desert between Reno and Las Vegas. I'd been fighting to stay awake for the last 50 miles, and when Buddy's Stop and Go materialized out of the mist like a mirage made solid, I almost wept with relief. But as I pulled up to the pumps, something felt different. The Wailing Glass. From Marcus Chend. There's something about driving through Oregon in late October that makes even the most rational man believe in ghosts. I've been pulling freight across this route for nearly 15 years, and I thought I'd seen everything these mountain passes could throw at me. Fog thick as cotton batting, ice storms that turn the asphalt into a skating rink, and winds that howl through the pine trees like banshees. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared me for what happened during that storm 3 weeks ago. I was hauling a load of electronics from Portland to Sacramento, running about 2 hours behind schedule due to a delay at the loading dock. The weather had been threatening all day, with those heavy gray clouds that seemed to press down on your shoulders like a wet blanket. By the time I reached the mountain pass near Crater Lake, the first fat raindrops were splattering against my windshield. My rig, a 2018 Kenworth W900 that I'd named Bertha, was running smooth as silk, her diesel engine humming that familiar lullaby that had been my companion through countless lonely nights on the road. The rain started gentle enough, just a light sprinkling that required only the occasional swipe of the wipers. I remember thinking how peaceful it looked, the way the droplets caught the glow of my headlights and scattered tiny prisms of light across the glass. The radio was playing some old country song about heartbreak and highways, and I was settling in for what I expected to be just another routine night drive through the mountain. You know how it is up in those mountains. The air current gets funneled between the peaks and creates all sorts of strange sounds. But as the rain began to fall harder and I switched my wipers to a steady rhythm, I noticed something odd about the noise they were making. Instead of the normal swish thump that I'd grown accustomed to over the years, there was something else mixed in. A thin, reedy sound that seemed to rise and fall with each pass of the blades across the glass. I turned down the radio, straining to hear over the increasing patter of rain against the cab. The sound was still there, threading through the mechanical rhythm like a discordant note in an otherwise familiar song. It almost sounded like singing or crying. I shook my head and cranked the radio back up, figuring it was just fatigue playing tricks on my mind. I'd been on the road for 12 hours straight, and the combination of caffeine and exhaustion can make a man's imagination run wild. The storm intensified as I climbed higher into the mountains. What had started as a gentle autumn shower transformed into a full-blown deluge that hammered against my windshield with increasing fury. I bumped the wiper speed up to high, and that's when the sound became unmistakable. It wasn't the wind, and it wasn't my imagination. My left wiper blade was making a sound that no piece of rubber and metal had any business making. It was crying, not crying like a baby, mind you. This was different. It was the sound of pure anguish, a keening wail that seemed to come from somewhere deep and broken. Each time the blade swept across the glass, it released this mournful cry that sent ice water through my veins. I pulled over at the next scenic overlook, my hands shaking slightly as I set the parking brake and killed the engine. The rain drummed against the roof of my cab as I sat there in the sudden silence, trying to make sense of what I'd heard. Wiper blades don't cry. They don't make any sound except the mechanical scrape of rubber against glass. But even as I told myself this, I could feel a crawling sensation between my shoulder blades. That primitive warning system that tells you when something is fundamentally wrong with the world around you. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out into the driving rain. The cold mountain air hit me like a slap, and within seconds my jacket was soaked through. I made my way around to the front of the rig, playing my beam across the windshield and the wiper assembly. Everything looked normal. The blades were in good condition, relatively new, and properly seated in their brackets. There was no obvious damage, no loose connections, nothing that would explain the sound I'd been hearing. But as I stood there in the rain, examining the wipers with my flashlight, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The left wiper blade wasn't just wet from the rain. There was something else on it, a dark substance that seemed thicker than water, more viscous. In the harsh glare of my flashlight beam, it almost looked like, but that was impossible. I reached out with one gloved finger to touch it, and the moment my fingertip made contact with the blade, I heard it again, that heart-wrenching cry, so clear and unmistakable that I jerked my hand back and nearly dropped my flashlight. It had come from everywhere at once, echoing off the surrounding trees and mountainsides, like the call of some wounded creature lost in the wilderness. I stood there for a long moment, the rain plastering my hair to my skull and running down my face in cold rivulets, listening to the silence that followed. Then I heard something that made my knees go weak. Slow, deliberate footsteps splashing through puddles somewhere behind me in the darkness. No other vehicles, no people, nothing but the dark outline of pine trees swaying in the wind. But I could still hear them, those wet, squelching footsteps, circling around me just beyond the reach of my life. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might burst, and every instinct I had was screaming at me to get back in the truck and drive away as fast as possible. I stumbled back to the driver's side door, my hands fumbling with the handle in my haste to get inside. The moment I was back in the cab, I locked the doors and fired up the engine, not caring that I hadn't finished inspecting the wipers. Whatever was wrong with them could wait until I reached the next truck stop. Right now, all I wanted was to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever was stalking around out there in the rain. I pulled back onto the highway with my tires spinning on the wet asphalt, the headlights carving a tunnel of visibility through the storm. The rain was coming down harder than ever, and I had no choice but to turn the wipers back on. The moment they began their rhythmic sweep across the glass, the crying started again. But this time it was different. This time it sounded like a voice, thin and desperate, calling out words I couldn't quite understand. As I drove deeper into the mountains, the voice became clearer. It was a woman's voice, high and breathless, with panic, and she was saying the same thing over and over again with each pass of the wiper blade. "Help me," she whispered. "Please, somebody help me." The words were so clear, so heartbreakingly real, that I found myself looking around the empty cab, as if she might be sitting right there beside me. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles had gone white, and I realized I was hyperventilating. I forced myself to slow my breathing, to think rationally about what was happening. Wiper blades don't talk, they don't cry, and they don't plead for help. There had to be a logical explanation for what I was experiencing. Maybe it was some kind of acoustic phenomenon, the wind and rain creating sounds that my stressed mind was interpreting as voices. Maybe it was a radio signal, somehow getting picked up by the metal components of the wiper assembly. But even as I tried to rationalize what I was hearing, the voice continued its desperate plea with each sweep of the blade. "Help me, please help me, somebody please help me." And underneath the words I could hear something else, the sound of breathing, rapid and panicked, like someone running for their life. That's when I saw her in my headlights. She was standing on the shoulder of the road about 50 yards ahead, a young woman in a white dress that was plastered to her body by the rain. Her dark hair hung in wet tangles around her face, and her arms were raised as if she were flagging me down. For a moment relief flooded through me. Here was the logical explanation I'd been searching for. Somehow, this woman's voice was being transmitted through my wiper blade. Maybe through some freak atmospheric condition, or electronic interference. She needed help, and my truck was picking up her desperate calls. But as I got closer, something about the scene began to trouble me. The voice beyond the glass, From Marcus Rivera, the highway stretched endlessly before me. That October night, my Kenworth's headlights carving through the darkness like twin searchlights, hunting for something that didn't want to be found. I'd been driving the same route between Denver and Salt Lake City for nearly 15 years, hauling everything from electronics to frozen goods, but I'd never experienced anything quite like what happened during those 72 hours when my truck's passenger window started talking to me. It began innocuously enough, the way most unsettling things do. The evening air had turned crisp with the promise of an early winter, and I'd rolled down the passenger window just a crack to let some fresh mountain air circulate through the cab. The elevation was getting to me, making the interior feel stuffy, despite the cool temperature outside. My cargo this time was nothing unusual, just a load of furniture heading to a warehouse in Provo, but something about the night felt different, charged with an energy I couldn't quite identify. The radio had been crackling with static for the better part of an hour, picking up fragments of distant conversations between other drivers and occasionally catching pieces of late-night talk shows that seemed to fade in and out like whispers carried on the wind. I'd given up trying to find a clear station and had settled into that meditative state that long-haul drivers know well, where the steady rumble of the engine and the rhythmic thrum of tires on asphalt create a kind of mechanical lullaby. That's when I first heard it, so soft I almost dismissed it as wind passing through the partially open window. A voice, barely audible above the ambient noise of the truck, seemed to be coming from somewhere near my right ear. At first I thought it might be the CB radio picking up a weak transmission, but when I glanced at the unit, it was clearly off, the display dark and silent. The voice came again, clearer this time, and I felt my hands tighten involuntarily on the steering wheel. It was speaking my name, drawing out the syllables in a way that made my skin prickle with unease. "Marcus," it said, and the word seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have, echoing slightly as if the cab of my truck had suddenly become much larger than its actual dimension. I pulled over at the next rest stop, a small graveled area carved into the mountainside, with a few picnic tables and a view of the valley below that would have been stunning in daylight, but now appeared as nothing more than an ocean of black punctuated by distant light. The silence after I shut off the engine was profound, broken only by the ticking of cooling metal and the distant sound of wind moving through pine trees that flanked the rest area. I walked around the truck twice, checking the cargo straps and inspecting the trailer, looking for any loose metal or equipment that might be creating unusual sounds. Everything appeared normal, secure and properly fastened. The passenger window, when I examined it closely, showed nothing unusual, just the standard safety glass, with a light coating of road dust, and the occasional splatter from inside. Back in the cab, I sat in the driver's seat for several minutes, listening intently to the night sounds filtering in through the slightly open window. An owl called from somewhere in the trees, its voice haunting but perfectly natural. A truck passed on the highway below, its engine noise dopplering away into the distance. But there was something else, a quality to the silence that felt expectant, as if the night itself was holding its breath. When I started the engine and pulled back onto the highway, the voice returned almost immediately, this time speaking in full sentences that made my blood run cold. It knew things about me that no one should have known, intimate details from my past that I'd never shared with anyone. It spoke about my daughter Sarah, who had died in a car accident 3 years earlier, describing the exact color of the dress she'd been wearing the last time I saw her alive. It mentioned my ex-wife Linda, recounting conversations we'd had during our divorce proceedings that had taken place in the privacy of a lawyer's office. The voice seemed to emanate from the window itself, as if the glass had somehow become a conduit for something that existed in the space between the interior of my truck and the rushing darkness outside. When I rolled the window up completely, the voice became muffled but didn't disappear entirely, taking on a quality that reminded me of someone speaking from underwater, or from the bottom of a deep well. Mile after mile passed, and the voice continued its unsettling monologue, sometimes speaking so quietly I had to strain to hear it, other times becoming loud enough that I worried it might be audible to other drivers on the CB radio. It told me stories about other truck drivers who had traveled this same stretch of highway, describing accidents and incidents that I'd never heard about but that sounded disturbingly plausible. It spoke of a driver named Tommy who had jackknifed his rig in a snowstorm and spent his final moments calling for help that never came, and of a woman named Carol whose truck had broken down in this same area and who had simply vanished, leaving behind only an empty cab and a load of produce that spoiled while authorities searched unsuccessfully for any trace of her. As the night wore on, the voice began asking me questions, wanting to know about my fears, my regrets, the decisions I'd made that kept me awake during those quiet hours before dawn, when the mind tends to dwell on darker thought. It was particularly interested in my relationship with Sarah, probing gently but persistently about our last conversation, about the argument we'd had before she stormed out of the house and into the path of the drunk driver who ended her life. I tried everything I could think of to make it stop. I rolled the window up and down repeatedly, checked the CB radio multiple times to make sure it wasn't somehow malfunctioning and picking up strange transmissions, even pulled over twice more to examine the window mechanism for any possible explanation. But each time I resumed driving, the voice returned, now seeming to take on characteristics that reminded me uncomfortably of Sarah's voice, particularly when she was upset or trying to communicate something important. The highway began to descend from the mountains, winding through curves that required my full attention, but the voice seemed to intensify during these sections, where my concentration was divided between listening and navigating. It began describing the landscape outside in perfect detail, mentioning landmarks and geographical features that were invisible in the darkness, but that I knew to be accurate from my many previous trips through this area. It spoke of abandoned mines carved into the mountainsides, of forgotten settlements that had flourished briefly during the gold rush and then faded into ghost towns, of indigenous burial grounds that predated European settlement by centuries. During the second night, the voice began to change, taking on different vocal characteristics and speech patterns, as if multiple entities were taking turns using the window as their means of communication. Sometimes it sounded like an elderly man with a thick accent I couldn't identify, other times like a young woman who seemed to be speaking from a great distance. There were moments when the voice became so distorted that I couldn't make out individual words, just an undulating sound that rose and fell like some kind of supernatural keening. The voice had been mostly quiet during the daylight hours, occasionally murmuring words I couldn't quite catch but generally remaining dormant while the sun was up. But as dusk fell and I found myself once again navigating the mountain passes, it returned with an urgency that made my hands shake on the steering wheel. It began demanding that I pull over, insisting that there was something I needed to see, something important that couldn't wait until I reached my destination. The tone became increasingly aggressive, shifting from the conversational quality of the previous nights to something that sounded almost desperate, as if whatever was speaking through the window was running out of time to accomplish some crucial task. When I refused to stop, multiple voices began speaking simultaneously, creating a cacophony of overlapping words and phrases that made it impossible to understand what any of them were trying to say. The sound grew so loud that I was certain it must be audible outside the truck, but when I passed a state trooper parked on the shoulder, he showed no reaction, simply watching my truck go by with the routine disinterest of an officer monitoring traffic. Finally, unable to concentrate on driving safely with the supernatural chorus filling my cab, I pulled into a truck stop near the Utah border, parking under the harsh fluorescent lights and shutting off the engine with trembling hand. The moment the rumble of the diesel ceased, the voices stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so complete that my ears rang with the sudden absence of sound. For just a moment I thought I saw something in the glass itself, not a reflection but something that seemed to exist within the molecular structure of the window. Faces perhaps, or abstract patterns that suggested human features, shifting and changing too quickly for me to focus on any individual image. A fellow trucker was standing outside, a concerned expression on his weathered face. The cargo that breathed. For Marcus Chen, the manifest said livestock. But when I backed my Peterbilt up to the loading dock in Amarillo that September night, there wasn't a sound coming from inside that trailer. Not a moo, not a bleat, not even the shuffling of hooves on metal flooring that you'd expect from cattle or sheep settling in for a long haul. Just silence, thick and heavy as the humid Texas air that clung to my shirt like a second skin. I've been running freight for 23 years, and in that time I've hauled everything from racehorses to laboratory mice, exotic birds to prize bulls, worth more than my truck. Animals make noise, especially when they're stressed from loading. They call out to each other, they move around, they let you know they're alive in there. But this trailer, this 48-foot refrigerated unit, bound for a research facility outside Portland, might as well have been carrying frozen beef for all the sound it made. The loading supervisor, a thin man with nervous eyes who kept checking his watch, handed me the paperwork without meeting my gaze. When I asked about the unusual quiet, he just shrugged and mumbled something about sedation for transport. The bills were all in order, the pay was good, and I had a schedule to keep. Sometimes in this business, you learn not to ask too many questions. Interstate 40 stretched out before me like a ribbon of black glass under the star-scattered sky, my headlights carving a tunnel through the darkness. The engine hummed its familiar lullaby, 18 wheels singing their steady rhythm on asphalt, and I let myself fall into that meditative state that comes with long-distance driving. The CB radio crackled occasionally with chatter from other drivers, but mostly it was just me, the road, and whatever cargo slept silently behind me. It wasn't until I reached the New Mexico border that I first heard it, a sound so soft I almost missed it beneath the drone of the engine, like a whisper carried on wind. At first I thought it might be air escaping from the reefer unit, but the temperature gauge showed the refrigeration system running perfectly. The sound came again, longer this time, and with it came the strangest sensation that something was listening to the rhythm of my truck, learning the pattern of our movement through the night. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in that harsh white glow that makes the desert night seem even blacker by contrast. I walked around the rig doing my inspection, checking tires and lights, running my hand along the refrigerated trailer's smooth aluminum side. Everything looked normal, but when I pressed my ear to the metal, I could swear I heard something like breathing, slow and deep, and perfectly synchronized. He kept glancing at my trailer with an expression I couldn't quite read, somewhere between curiosity and unease. When he asked what I was hauling, I told him livestock, but even as the words left my mouth, they felt wrong somehow. What kind of livestock breathed in perfect unison like that? Back on the road, climbing into the mountains of northern New Mexico, the sounds from the trailer began to change. What had been soft whispers became something more distinct, almost like a conversation carried out in frequencies just below human hearing. I found myself turning down the radio, straining to make out words that probably weren't there. The darkness outside seemed to press closer against the windshield, and twice I caught myself checking the mirrors, not for other traffic, but for some sign of what might be stirring in the trailer behind me. The real unease began somewhere around Flagstaff, Arizona, in the dead hours before dawn, when the world feels most empty and strange. I was climbing a long grade, engine working hard, when I felt the trailer shift. Not the normal sway you get from live cargo moving around, but something different, something purposeful. It was as if whatever was back there had been studying the motion of the truck, learning to move with it, and was now testing its ability to influence our path. I gripped the steering wheel tighter and kept my eyes on the road, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer alone in making decisions about where this truck was going. The trailer seemed to be pulling slightly to the left, not enough to be dangerous, but enough to require constant small corrections. When I stopped at a rest area to check the axles and brakes, everything looked perfect. No mechanical explanation for what I was feeling. The mountains of northern Arizona gave way to the vast emptiness of Nevada, and with each passing mile, the presence in the trailer seemed to grow stronger. I could feel it now even when I couldn't hear it, a weight that had nothing to do with the physical load I was carrying. It was awareness, intelligence, something that had been sleeping or dormant during those first quiet hours, but was now fully awake and taking notice of its surrounding. Near Las Vegas, as the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, I made the mistake of looking in my side mirror at exactly the wrong moment. The trailer had small ventilation ports near the top, standard equipment for livestock transport, and for just an instant, I could have sworn I saw something move past one of those openings. Not an animal, not anything I could identify, just a shape that seemed to flow like liquid shadow from one vent to another. The parking lot was nearly empty, just a few other big rigs, scattered under the yellow sodium lights, their drivers catching a few hours of sleep before the morning rush. I walked back to my trailer one more time, moving slowly. Listen. The breathing sound was definitely there now, no longer something I had to strain to hear. It came from multiple sources, as if whatever was in there had divided or multiplied during the night. But it was still synchronized, still moving in that perfect rhythm that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I found myself breathing along with it, without meaning to, my own lungs falling into step with whatever was in there. That's when I noticed the temperature gauge on the reefer unit. It was reading normal, but the metal sides of the trailer felt warm to the touch. Not hot, just warm, as if heated from within by something that generated its own body heat, despite being transported in a refrigerated environment. I thought about the research facility in Portland, wondered what kind of experiments required subjects that could regulate their own temperature, that could coordinate their movements and breathing with such precision. The drive through the Sierra Nevada mountains should have been beautiful. Sunrise painting the peaks in shades of gold and rose, but I barely noticed the scenery. All my attention was focused on the growing sense that my cargo was taking an active interest in our route. The trailer seemed to lean into curves before I'd even started turning the wheel, as if whatever was inside could sense the road ahead. More than once I felt a subtle shift in weight that helped the truck maintain stability on steep grades, and I began to wonder if I was being assisted rather than simply transporting a passive load. The sounds from the trailer had become a constant low conversation, rising and falling like a tide of whispered voices. I couldn't make out words, might not have wanted to even if I could, but there was definitely communication happening back there. Planning, perhaps. Discussion of what lay ahead. The research facility was located in a remote valley east of Portland, accessible only by a winding 2-lane road that cut through dense forest. As I turned off the main highway, following the GPS coordinates I'd been given, the forest seemed to close in around us like a living thing. The trees were old-growth Douglas fir, massive trunks disappearing up into green shadows, and I had the unsettling feeling that we were being watched from among them. The facility itself was smaller than I'd expected, just a few low buildings behind a high fence topped with razor wire. But what struck me immediately was how quiet it was. No people moving around, no vehicles in the parking area, no signs of the kind of activity you'd expect at a place that was expecting a delivery. Just empty buildings, and that oppressive silence that had become all too familiar. I backed up to the receiving dock as directed, but no one came out to meet me. The loading bay doors remained closed, and when I climbed down from the cab to look for someone in charge, I found the facility's main entrance locked tight. There was a phone number posted on a sign, but when I tried calling, it went straight to voicemail. The breathing sounds had stopped completely, replaced by something that might have been excitement or anticipation. Whatever was in that trailer knew we'd reached our destination, and it was responding in ways that made my skin crawl. The tunnel that grew overnight. From Marcus Thompson. I've been hauling freight through the mountain passes of Colorado for nearly 20 years, and I thought I knew every mile of Interstate 70 like the back of my weathered hands. The route between Denver and Grand Junction had become as familiar to me as my own heartbeat, each curve and grade memorized through countless runs in my Peterbilt 3.9. But sometimes the mountains have their own way of reminding you that familiarity breeds dangerous assumptions. It was a Thursday night in late October when everything I thought I knew about that stretch of highway got turned upside down. The dispatch had sent me out with a load of automotive parts bound for a factory in Utah. Nothing unusual about the cargo or the timeline. The weather had been crisp but clear when I'd pulled out of the Denver terminal just after midnight, my rig's diesel engine purring with that steady, reassuring rumble that had lulled me through thousands of miles of darkness. The first hint that something wasn't quite right came about 2 hours into the drive. I was climbing through the foothills, my headlights cutting through the thin mountain air, when I noticed construction signs that I didn't remember seeing on my last run through here just 3 days prior. Orange and white barriers lined the shoulder, and electronic message boards flickered with warnings about lane restrictions ahead. The strange thing was, I hadn't heard anything on the CB about construction work in this area, and usually the other drivers were quick to share information about delays or detours. My coffee had grown cold in the cup holder, but I took a sip anyway, the bitter liquid helping me stay focused as the grades steepened. The radio crackled with distant conversations between drivers somewhere far ahead or behind me, their voices mixing with the static in a way that made their words indistinct and almost musical. Outside my windshield, the darkness seemed deeper than usual, as if the moon and stars had decided to hide themselves behind clouds that I couldn't quite see. As I rounded a familiar bend, one that should have given me a clear view of the valley below scattered with the lights of small mountain towns, I found myself staring at something that made me ease off the accelerator with confusion. Where there should have been open sky and distant peaks, a massive concrete structure loomed ahead. At first glance it looked like a tunnel entrance, but the proportions seemed wrong somehow, too large and too perfectly circular, like a giant's eye socket carved into the mountainside. I downshifted and let my rig coast as I tried to process what I was seeing. The tunnel mouth was illuminated by harsh sodium lights that cast everything in an unsettling yellow glow, making the concrete appear almost organic, like yellowed bone. Construction equipment sat silent and abandoned along the roadside, bulldozers and excavators that looked as though they'd been working recently, their surfaces still clean of the dust that accumulates quickly in this dry mountain air. The CB radio suddenly crackled to life with a voice I didn't recognize, speaking in the flat, emotionless tone that dispatchers sometimes use during long night shifts. All eastbound and westbound traffic on I-70, be advised of the new Blackrock tunnel. Reduce speed to 35 miles per hour. Maintain safe following distance. No stopping inside the tunnel structure. I reached for the CB handset, intending to ask for clarification about this tunnel that definitely hadn't existed 3 days ago. But the radio had fallen silent again except for the soft hiss of static. My GPS system showed the usual route information, displaying the familiar highway markers, but there was no indication of any tunnel on the digital map. The screen showed the road continuing straight ahead through what should have been open mountain terrain. As I approached the tunnel entrance, my headlights revealed more details that didn't sit right with me. The concrete work looked fresh, almost wet, despite the dry weather. There were no visible construction dates or contractor information posted anywhere, which was unusual for a project of this magnitude. Most puzzling of all, the tunnel appeared to be perfectly round, rather than the typical arch design used for highway tunnels, and the walls seemed to curve away into darkness beyond what my lights could penetrate. A car passed me going the opposite direction, emerging from the tunnel with its headlights flickering erratically. I caught a glimpse of the driver's face as we passed, pale and strained with an expression that might have been confusion or fear. The car's taillights disappeared around the bend behind me before I could get a better look, leaving me alone with the growing certainty that something about this situation was fundamentally wrong. I pulled my rig to a stop at the tunnel entrance, letting the engine idle while I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The structure stretched ahead into absolute darkness, my headlights seeming to be absorbed by the black void rather than illuminating the far end. The walls were perfectly smooth, without the usual rough texture of drilled and blasted rock, or the visible seams of concrete forms. They seemed to have been carved or molded as one continuous piece, and they glistened slightly as if they were damp, or covered with something I couldn't identify. The air flowing from the tunnel carried an odd smell, not the typical odors of concrete dust, diesel exhaust, or road salt that you'd expect from highway construction. Instead, there was something organic about it, like the smell of rich earth after rain, mixed with something else that I couldn't quite place but that made my skin crawl. It was the kind of smell that triggered some primitive warning system in the back of my brain, the same instinct that tells you to avoid dark caves or deep water. I tried my cell phone, thinking I could call dispatch or check online for information about this mysterious tunnel, but the screen showed no signal bars. That wasn't unusual in these mountains, but the timing felt ominous. I considered turning around, finding an alternate route, but that would add hours to my delivery schedule, and I'd have to explain the delay without being able to provide a reasonable justification. It was a pickup truck that pulled alongside my cab, the driver rolling down his window with a questioning expression. He was an older man, probably a local based on his weathered appearance, and the way he seemed comfortable navigating these mountain roads in the dark. "You having trouble with your rig?" he called out over the sound of both our engines. "No, just trying to figure out when they built this tunnel," I replied. "I was through here earlier this week, and there was nothing but mountainside." The man's expression shifted to confusion, then something that might have been concern. "What tunnel?" he asked, looking ahead through his windshield at the massive concrete entrance that was clearly visible in both our headlight beams. I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "That tunnel," I said, pointing directly at the structure. "Right there in front of us." "Son, I don't see any tunnel. Just the road heading up the mountain like it always has." I shouted a warning, but instead of crashing, his vehicle seemed to pass through the structure as if it wasn't there at all, his taillights disappearing into what looked to me like solid stone, but apparently was nothing more than empty air to him. My hands were shaking as I gripped the steering wheel, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. Either I was experiencing some kind of hallucination, possibly carbon monoxide poisoning from a leak in my exhaust system, or I was seeing something that existed only for me. Neither possibility was comforting, but I couldn't sit here indefinitely trying to solve the mystery. I eased off the brake and let my rig roll forward into the tunnel, watching my speedometer carefully to maintain the 35 miles per hour that the radio voice had specified. The moment I passed the threshold, the temperature seemed to drop noticeably, and the sound of my engine changed, becoming muffled and distorted as if I were underwater. My headlights, which had been unable to penetrate the darkness from outside, now revealed tunnel walls that stretched ahead in a perfectly straight line, farther than should have been possible given the mountain's geography. The walls themselves were the most unsettling part of the experience. They appeared to be made of the same smooth concrete I'd seen at the entrance, but they seemed to pulse gently, expanding and contracting like the walls of a living throat. The surface had a wet organic quality that made me think of the inside of a mouth or digestive tract. My rational mind tried to dismiss these observations as tricks of light and shadow, stress-induced hallucinations brought on by the strange situation, but my instincts were screaming that I needed to get out of this place as quickly as possible. The radio crackled again with that same emotionless voice. "Maintain current speed. Do not stop. Do not attempt to turn around. Exit is ahead." The voice that knows too much. From Marcus Steele Rodriguez. The CB radio had been silent for the better part of 3 hours, as I rolled through the endless stretch of Nebraska, farmland, nothing but corn stalks and darkness pressing against my windshield. My Kenworth diesel engine hummed its familiar lullaby, a deep thrumming that had become as comforting as a heartbeat over my 15 years on the road. The dashboard clock glowed a ghostly green, showing 2:47 a.m., and I was fighting that familiar heaviness behind my eyelids when the radio crackled to life. Breaker 19. This here's Nighthawk looking for that eastbound Kenworth at mile marker 347. You copy, Peanut? My hands tightened on the steering wheel, and I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the October air seeping through my cab's weather stripping. Peanut. Nobody had called me that in over 25 years. That was what my grandmother used to call me when I was barely knee-high to a grasshopper, back when I'd spend summers at her farm in Missouri. She'd ruffle my hair and say, "Come here, my little Peanut," in that soft voice that smelled of vanilla and fresh-baked cookies. The name died with her when I was 12, buried along with the innocence of childhood and the belief that the world was a safe place. I reached for the CB handset, my fingers trembling slightly as I keyed the mic. "This is the eastbound Kenworth. How'd you know my handle, driver?" I tried to keep my voice steady, professional, but there was an edge creeping in that I couldn't quite suppress. The response came immediately, accompanied by a burst of static that seemed to carry whispers just beneath the white noise. "Oh, I know lots of things about you, Pete. Remember that summer when you were 8, when you found that old well behind your grandmother's barn? The one covered with rotting boards that you pried up with a rusty crowbar you found in the tool shed?" My blood turned to ice water in my vein. The CB handset nearly slipped from my suddenly sweating palm. That well, that damned well. I hadn't thought about it in decades, had spent considerable effort trying not to think about it. It was one of those childhood memories that lived in the dark corners of your mind, the kind you pretended never happened because acknowledging it meant accepting that the world contained things that simply shouldn't exist. I managed to croak into the microphone, my voice barely audible over the diesel's rumble. Outside my windows, the cornstalks seemed to bend inward toward the highway, as if they were listening, waiting. "You looked down into that well, didn't you, Peanut? Down, down, down into the darkness where the water should have been. But it wasn't water at the bottom, was it? Tell me what you saw down there in the deep, little boy. Tell old Nighthawk what was looking back up at you." I slammed the handset back into its cradle, my chest heaving as if I'd just run a marathon. The silence in the cab felt oppressive now, broken only by the steady rhythm of my truck's engine and the soft whisper of wind across the windshield. Mile marker 348 flashed by in my headlights, and I realized I was unconsciously pressing harder on the accelerator, as if I could outrun the voice on the radio and the memories it was dragging up from their carefully buried grave. But the memories came anyway, unbidden and unwelcome. That summer at Grandma's farm, before the cancer took her, before the world became complicated with high school and jobs and the desperate need to escape small-town Missouri, I'd been exploring, the way 8-year-old boys do, poking around in places I probably shouldn't have been. The old well was hidden behind the barn, covered with weathered boards that looked like they hadn't been disturbed in decades. Curiosity, that damning trait that had gotten me into trouble more times than I could count, compelled me to pry up those boards with a crowbar I'd found. But as my eyes adjusted, I began to make out something at the bottom, something that definitely wasn't water. It looked like earth, rich and black, but it was moving in slow, hypnotic patterns, like thick oil or molasses. And then, as I stared transfixed, shapes began to emerge from that dark soil, pale shapes that might have been hands, reaching upward, grasping at nothing, or maybe reaching for me. The CB crackled again, jolting me back to the present. "You ran away, didn't you, Peanut? Threw that crowbar down the well and ran back to Grandma's house. Never told a soul what you saw, but you've been carrying it with you ever since, haven't you?" In here the voice paused, and I could swear I heard a tapping sound, like fingernails against glass. Right here in your head where all the dark things live. Somehow I knew the voice would hear me anyway. "Can't do that, Peanut. You see, things that get buried don't always stay buried. Sometimes they find ways to follow you, especially when you spend your nights driving these lonely roads, broadcasting your location for anyone who cares to listen, anyone or anything." I glanced at my mirrors, half expecting to see headlights following me, but the highway stretched empty behind me, a ribbon of asphalt disappearing into the darkness. The cornfields on either side of the road seemed to ripple in the wind, creating the illusion of movement, of things running parallel to my truck just beyond the reach of my headlights. "That's a nice truck you got there, Peanut." 2019 Kenworth W900. Custom purple paint job with silver flame, same color as the bruises on your grandmother's arms near the end. When the medicine stopped working, you remember how she used to grab your wrist when the pain got bad? How her fingers left marks that looked just like those flames dancing along your calf? I was hyperventilating now, my vision starting to tunnel. How could this voice know these things? The details about the well were disturbing enough, but my grandmother's final days had been witnessed by only family, and most of them were dead now too. The purple and silver paint scheme was custom work I'd had done just last year in Denver. Nothing that would be in any official records that some twisted CB operator could access. Mile marker 352 swept by, and I noticed that the landscape was starting to change. The endless cornfields were giving way to something else, something that looked wrong in my peripheral vision. I didn't want to look directly at it, instinctively knowing that full awareness of what lay beyond my windows would shatter what little composure I had left. "You're getting close now, Peanut. Close to the place where all roads lead for folks like you. Folks who've seen things they shouldn't have seen, who carry secrets in their bones like tumors. Just another few miles, and you'll understand why I've been calling you." The needle on the fuel gauge began to flutter, though I knew the tank was 3/4 full. My headlights flickered, dimmed, then brightened again, casting strange shadows that seemed to move independently of my truck's motion. "No," I said aloud, gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles. "This isn't real. This is just fatigue. Road hypnosis. I need to find a truck stop, get some coffee, maybe catch a few hours of sleep." But even as I said it, I knew I was lying to myself. This felt different from the hallucinations that sometimes came with too many hours behind the wheel. This felt intentional, purposeful, like something had been planning this encounter for a very long time. The CB hissed and popped, and when the voice came again, it was clearer than before, as if the speaker was now broadcasting from very close by. "Remember what your grandmother told you about the well, Peanut? After you finally worked up the courage to tell her what you'd seen, she got that look in her eyes, the one that meant she was seeing backwards through time, and she said, 'Some doors shouldn't be opened, little one, and once they're opened, they can never really be closed.'" I had told her. Eventually, the secret had eaten at me for weeks until I couldn't stand it anymore. Grandma had been sitting on the porch swing, the one that creaked in that particular way that old wood does, and I'd climbed up beside her and whispered what I'd seen in the well. The Shadow Rider, from Marcus Wheeler, broken only by the occasional cluster of lights that marks a truck stop or some forgotten town clinging to the highway's edge. I've been running this route for 15 years now, hauling everything from electronics to frozen goods in my Peterbilt 389, and I thought I'd seen every kind of strange the road had to offer. The lot lizards, the ghost lights that dance in your peripheral vision when you're too tired to be driving, the way certain stretches of asphalt seem to hum with something that isn't quite mechanical. But I'd never encountered anything like what happened that October night between Albuquerque and Amarillo, when I picked up a passenger that shouldn't have been there at all. The weather had been clear when I'd pulled out of the Flying J in Albuquerque around 11 p.m., my trailer loaded with computer equipment bound for Dallas. The forecast called for scattered clouds, nothing more, but about an hour into the drive I noticed the first drops hitting my windshield. Within minutes it had turned into a steady downpour that reduced visibility to maybe 100 yards ahead, the kind of rain that makes every other driver on the road suddenly forget how to maintain proper following distance. I'd slowed down to about 55, hazards blinking, when I saw the figure on the shoulder. At first it was just a dark shape against the guardrail, barely visible through the sheets of rain and the rhythmic sweep of my wiper. I might have dismissed it as a trick of the light, maybe a road sign or construction equipment, but something about the way it seemed to move, A subtle shift in posture that suggested human presence made me ease off the throttle and guide my rig toward the shoulder. Company policy was clear about picking up hitchhikers. Don't do it, period. Insurance liability, safety concerns, the whole 9 yards. But out here in the middle of nowhere, with the rain coming down like the end of the world, leaving someone stranded felt wrong in a way that went deeper than corporate guidelines. I'd want someone to stop for me if I were stuck out there, soaked to the bone and miles from the nearest help. I brought the truck to a gentle stop about 20 feet past the figure and watched in my side mirror as I could see now, approached the passenger door. The rain was really coming down, drumming against the roof of my cab with an intensity that made normal conversation difficult, but I could hear his footsteps on the wet asphalt, slow and deliberate. When he knocked on the passenger door, it was 3 measured taps, polite and patient, despite the circumstance. I leaned across the cab and opened the door, expecting to see a thoroughly soaked traveler grateful for rescue from the storm. Instead, I found myself looking at someone who appeared oddly dry despite having been standing in the downpour. He was tall and thin, wearing what looked like an old-fashioned dark suit that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His face was pale and angular, with deep-set eyes that caught the amber glow from my instrument panel in an unsettling way. "Appreciate the ride," he said, his voice carrying easily over the sound of the rain. "Heading east, if that works with your route." There was something about his accent I couldn't place, something that suggested he might be from somewhere far from here, though I couldn't pin down exactly where. I nodded and gestured for him to climb up into the cab. "No problem. Name's Marcus. How long were you out there?" He settled into the passenger seat with an odd sort of grace, as if he were lighter than he should be. "Time gets away from you in weather like this," he replied, not quite answering the question. "I'm grateful for your kindness." I put the truck back in gear and eased onto the highway, noting that my passenger hadn't given me his name. Some people were just private, I figured, especially when they found themselves in vulnerable situations. I'd give him space and let him warm up before trying to make conversation. But as the miles rolled by, I began to notice things that didn't quite add up. Despite claiming to have been standing in that torrential rain, his clothes showed no signs of moisture. No water dripped from his hair or ran off his jacket onto the seat. Even stranger, I couldn't smell that wet clothes odor that should have filled the cab. Instead, there was something else, a faint scent like old flowers or maybe earth after a long drought. I glanced over at him as we passed under a particularly bright overpass light, and for just a moment, something seemed wrong with his reflection in the passenger window. It was too faint, too insubstantial, like looking at someone through deep water. I blinked and looked again, but the light had passed and we were back in the relative darkness of the rain-swept highway. "You from around here?" I asked, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that was settling in my stomach. "I've been traveling this road for a very long time," he said, still not really answering my question. His voice had a quality that made it hard to tell if he was young or old, and when I glanced over at him again, his face seemed to fade into the shadows of the cab in a way that made my eyes want to slide away from him. The rain was getting worse, if that was possible, turning the highway into a river of reflected headlights and taillights. I had to focus on my driving, fighting to keep the truck steady as crosswinds began to buffet the trailer. But I kept stealing glances at my passenger, and each time I looked, he seemed less substantial than before, as if he were slowly fading away. "You feeling okay?" I asked, genuinely concerned. Maybe he'd been out in the cold longer than I'd thought. Maybe he was going into shock or hypothermia. He turned to look at me then, and I saw that his eyes reflected the green glow of my dashboard lights, like an animal's. "I'm fine, Marcus, just tired. It's been a long journey." The way he said my name made my skin crawl, though I couldn't say why. It was just my name, after all, the one I'd given him when he'd climbed into the cab. But hearing it in his voice felt wrong, like he'd known it long before I'd introduced myself. We drove in silence for the next 20 miles or so, the only sounds the steady rumble of the diesel engine, the rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers, and the constant drumming of rain on the roof. I tried to focus on the road, on the familiar routine of long-haul driving, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed in my cab since I'd picked up my passenger. It was when we passed the exit for Santa Rosa that I realized I could no longer see him clearly in my peripheral vision. When I looked straight at him, he was there, still sitting in the passenger seat, still wearing that dark suit that seemed to drink light. But when I wasn't looking directly at him, when he existed only in the edge of my sight, he seemed to flicker and fade like a bad television signal. "Where exactly are you headed?" I asked, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the confined space of the cab. "East," he repeated, the same non-answer he'd given before. "Always east, following the highway." I was about to press him for more details when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In the passenger window, clearly visible against the dark landscape rushing past outside, I could see my own reflection looking back at me, but the passenger seat beside me appeared empty in the glass, showing only the worn fabric and the small pillow I kept there for my mandatory rest breaks. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I forced myself to look directly at my passenger again. He was still there, still solid and present, but now I could see something else about him that I'd missed before. The way the light from the instrument panel seemed to pass through him rather than illuminate him. The way his clothes didn't move with the vibration of the truck. The way he sat perfectly still, unnaturally still, as if breathing were something he'd forgotten how to do. I whispered, the words escaping before I could stop them. He smiled then, and his teeth gleamed with their own pale light in the darkness of the cab. "I'm just a traveler, Marcus, like you, moving from one place to another, following the endless highway." But as he spoke, his form began to waver more noticeably, becoming translucent around the edges. I could see the rain-streaked passenger window through his shoulder, could make out the texture of the seat through his torso. He was fading away like morning mist, becoming less and less substantial with each passing mile. I checked my mirrors, scanned the dark landscape for broken-down motorists or accident scenes, but the highway was empty, except for the occasional set of taillights disappearing over distant hills. The crying sound continued, rising and falling in pitch like a siren or a child's sob, and I found myself pressing the accelerator harder, wanting to outrun whatever was making that noise. The engine responded beautifully, pulling the heavy load up a long grade without strain, but the fuel gauge was dropping faster than it should have been, despite the attendant's promises of increased efficiency. More troubling was the way the sound seemed to be getting louder, not fainter, as if its source was not some external phenomenon, but something traveling with me. I pulled into a rest area near the town of Big Spring, parking under a lone security light that cast everything in harsh white and deep black. The engine ticked as it cooled, but underneath that familiar sound was something else, a whisper of noise that seemed to be coming from the fuel tanks themselves. I walked around the rig, checking connections and looking for leaks, but everything appeared normal except for a faint odor rising from the area around the fuel caps. It wasn't the usual diesel smell, but something organic and unpleasant, like flowers left too long in water or meat beginning to turn. Back in the cab, I tried to convince myself that fatigue was playing tricks on my senses, that the mind could conjure all sorts of phantom sounds and smells after too many hours on the road. But when I started the engine to continue the journey, the crying sound returned immediately, clearer now and definitely coming from somewhere beneath the cab. It rose and fell with the engine's RPMs, growing louder when I accelerated and softer at idle, as if whatever was making the noise was being fed by the combustion process itself. The highway between Big Spring and Abilene is lonelier than a grave at midnight, with nothing but scrub brush and oil derricks stretching to either horizon. I'd driven this route hundreds of times, but tonight it felt different, as if the familiar landmarks were shifting positions when I wasn't looking directly at them. The crying sound had evolved into something more complex, not just a single voice but multiple tones, weaving together in harmonies that made my skin crawl and my hands shake on the steering wheel. When I reached a long downgrade where I could coast without using much fuel, the sound diminished but didn't disappear entirely. It was then that I realized the horrible truth. Whatever was making that noise was actually being burned in the engine. The fuel I'd purchased wasn't just contaminated or chemically altered. It contained something alive, something capable of suffering, something that screamed each time a molecule of it was consumed in the combustion process. I thought about the attendant's smile, about the experimental refining process he'd mentioned, about the crude oil that had been pulled from deep places in the earth where things might exist that weren't meant to see daylight. The Permian Basin was old, geologically speaking, with rock formations that dated back millions of years. What if the drilling had tapped into more than just fossil fuel? What if something had been sleeping in those depths? Something that had become part of the crude oil through processes too ancient and alien to comprehend. The screaming intensified as I climbed another grade, multiple voices now clearly distinguishable in a chorus of agony that seemed to vibrate through the chassis and into my bones. I could feel it in my teeth, in my spine, in the hollow spaces behind my eyes. The engine was running perfectly, better than it ever had, but each revolution of the pistons brought fresh waves of that terrible sound, as if I was operating some kind of mechanical torture device rather than a truck engine. I tried reducing my speed to lower the RPMs, but traffic was light and the posted limits were high, and driving too slowly would attract the attention of highway patrol officers who might ask questions I couldn't answer. How do you explain to a state trooper that your fuel is screaming? How do you tell someone that you're afraid to stop the engine because you don't know if whatever is in there will die quietly or find some other way to express its anguish? Near the town of Sweetwater, I passed a truck stop that was still open, its lights promising sanctuary and normal fuel from normal suppliers. I started to signal for the off-ramp, then hesitated. If I refueled now, would the new diesel mix with the old? Would that make things better or worse? And what would happen to whatever was left in the tanks when the service bay drained them for cleaning? Would it continue screaming in barrels or holding tanks until someone else unknowingly burned it? I stayed on the highway, trapped between the ethical weight of my cargo's suffering and the practical necessity of completing my delivery. The load of drilling equipment behind me was needed at a job site near Lubbock, and my contract specified arrival by dawn. But every mile brought fresh waves of that agonized crying, and I found myself gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles had gone white and my forearms ached. The landscape outside grew more desolate as I continued west, nothing but endless darkness, punctuated by the occasional glow of a distant farmhouse or the skeletal silhouette of wind turbines spinning lazily in the night breeze. The screaming had taken on a rhythmic quality now, rising and falling in patterns that almost seemed like language, as if whatever burned in my engine was trying to communicate something beyond mere pain. Pleas for mercy, perhaps, or warnings about what lay deeper in the earth, where the oil had come from. Maybe it was trying to tell me about others like itself, trapped in wells and refineries and fuel tanks across the oil patch, all of them crying out in frequencies too high or too low for human ears to detect, except under the right conditions. As I passed the city limits of Lubbock, the fuel gauge showing less than a quarter tank, I made my decision. The frequency of the heart. From Marcus Brennan, the static started somewhere outside Amarillo, just past midnight when the highway stretched empty in both directions like a black ribbon pulled taut across the Texas plains. I'd been driving my Peterbilt 389 for 16 hours straight, pushing the legal limits, but staying within that gray area where a good logbook and an understanding dispatcher could make things work. The radio had been my companion through Oklahoma and into the Panhandle, playing that mix of late-night talk shows and classic country that keeps a driver's mind occupied during the lonesome hours. But now there was only static, a soft white noise that seemed almost rhythmic, like breathing or the distant sound of waves against a shore I couldn't see. I reached for the dial, expecting to find a clear station somewhere in the electronic fog. But as my fingers touched the chrome knob, something made me pause. The static wasn't random at all. It had a pattern, a steady pulse that seemed to match the rhythm of my own heartbeat. The headlights carved through darkness so complete It felt solid, illuminating nothing but asphalt and the occasional reflective marker post. No other vehicles, no ranch lights in the distance, just the endless expanse of prairie that swallowed sound and light with equal indifference. The CB radio crackled occasionally, but even the chatterbox drivers who usually filled the airwaves with their stories and complaints had gone quiet. It was as if I was the only person moving through this slice of America, guided by nothing but the white lines disappearing beneath my wheels and that strange pulsing static from the radio. I checked my mirrors out of habit, watching the red glow of my taillights fade into the void behind me. The trailer was loaded with electronics bound for Phoenix, 26 pallets of computers and circuit boards that hummed with their own electronic whispers. Sometimes on long hauls like this, I swear I can feel the cargo in the trailer, not its weight but its presence, like passengers who've paid for a ride to somewhere they've never been. The static grew stronger as I crested a low hill, and for a moment it resolved into something that almost sounded like music, a low melodic tone that rose and fell with mathematical precision. I leaned forward, straining to hear more clearly, and that's when I noticed the fuel gauge. The needle sat just above a quarter tank, which should have given me another 150 miles easy, but something about the way it trembled in its housing made me uneasy. The engine temperature looked good, oil pressure steady, but there was a quality to the engine's rhythm that I'd never heard before, a subtle syncopation that seemed to echo the pulse coming from the radio. 20 miles later, I saw the truck stop rising from the prairie like a neon oasis, its signs promising fuel and coffee, and the blessed relief of human contact. But as I downshifted and began the approach, I noticed something odd about the place. The signs were lit, the parking lot illuminated by tall sodium lights that painted everything in shades of amber, but I couldn't see any other truck. A place like this, positioned on a major freight corridor in the middle of nowhere, should have been busy with drivers grabbing sleep or stretching their legs. But the lot stood empty except for a single compact car parked near the building. I pulled up to the diesel pumps and shut down the engine, but the radio static continued, somehow growing louder in the sudden quiet. Even with the key removed from the ignition, that rhythmic pulse filled the cab, emanating from speakers that should have been silent. I opened the door and climbed down, expecting the sound to fade, but it seemed to follow me, carried on the cool night air like a frequency that had found resonance in the very atoms of the world. The fuel flowed steadily into my tanks, but I found myself listening to its gurgle with unusual attention, noting how the liquid's rhythm seemed to align with the static's pulse. A night clerk watched me through the store windows, a thin young man with pale skin and dark circles under his eyes, who moved with the deliberate slowness of someone fighting off sleep. When I made eye contact, he raised one hand in greeting, but there was something tentative about the gesture, as if he wasn't entirely sure I was really there. Inside the store, fluorescent lights hummed overhead with their familiar electrical buzz, but underneath that sound I could still hear the static, fainter now but persistent, like a heartbeat heard through a stethoscope, pressed to the wrong part of the body. The clerk stood behind the counter, his name tag identifying him as Derek, and when I approached to pay for fuel, he looked at me with an expression of relief, mixed with something that might have been fear. That sound on the radio, it's been going on for 3 hours now, ever since the last driver left. I thought maybe I was losing my mind, but you can hear. I nodded, pulling out my wallet, but Derek continued talking as if my confirmation had opened some floodgate of anxiety he'd been holding back. It started low, just background noise at first, but it keeps getting strong, and the weird thing is, it's coming through every radio in the place. The one behind the counter, the little boombox in the back office, even the sound system that plays the store music. All of them picking up the same signal, all of them broadcasting that same pulse. The coffee maker gurgled as it finished a fresh pot, and even that sound seemed to carry the rhythm we'd been hearing. I poured myself a large cup and added cream, noting how the liquid swirled with a pattern that reminded me of radio waves propagating through space. Derek watched my movements with intense attention, as if I might suddenly vanish or reveal myself to be some sort of hallucination. brought on by too many lonely nights in an empty truck stop? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear his theories. Sometimes the explanations people create for strange phenomena are more disturbing than the mysteries themselves. Derek shook his head, but his eyes held a knowledge he seemed reluctant to share. There's an old radio tower about 10 miles north of here, been abandoned since the 70s when the station went off the air. Sometimes truckers report picking up weird signals in this area, voices speaking languages that don't sound quite human, or music that seems to be playing backwards even though it's moving forward in time. But nothing like this, nothing so regular and persistent. I paid for the fuel and coffee, but found myself reluctant to leave the harsh comfort of the fluorescent lights and return to the cab where the static waited. Through the windows I could see my truck sitting patiently at the pump, its chrome gleaming under the amber parking lot lights, looking like every other Peterbilt that had ever hauled freight across the American highways. But something about its silhouette seemed different now, more angular somehow, as if the shadows were falling from directions that defied the geometry of the light sources around us. Highway 287 south of here connects back to the interstate about 40 miles down. Longer drive, but maybe you'd get away from whatever's causing this interference. The static greeted me as soon as I opened the truck door, louder than before and now accompanied by something that sounded almost like whispers, voices speaking just below the threshold of comprehension. I climbed into the cab and started the engine, but instead of drowning out the radio noise, the diesel's rumble seemed to harmonize with it, creating a complex rhythm that made my chest feel tight and my pulse quickened to match the electronic heartbeat filling the air. I pulled back onto the highway heading west, but the static followed, growing stronger with each mile. The whispers became more distinct, resolving into what sounded like conversations between people I couldn't see, discussions of coordinates and frequencies, and something they kept calling the pulse point. My CB radio, which should have been on a completely different frequency, had also succumbed to the strange signal, its speaker crackling with the same rhythmic static that seemed to be taking over every electronic device in the area. The fuel gauge, which had read full when I left the truck stop, now showed 3/4 and dropping steadily despite the fact that I couldn't have burned more than a few gallons. Other gauges flickered erratically, their needles dancing to the radio's pulse, as if the truck's electrical system had become an instrument in some vast, invisible orchestra. The headlights seemed dimmer than they should have been, and I noticed that their beams were creating unusual shadow patterns on the road ahead, geometric shapes that shifted and flowed like living things. 30 miles from the truck stop, the whispers on the radio suddenly stopped, replaced by a voice that spoke with perfect clarity. Unit 779, you are approaching the transmission point. Please maintain current speed and heading for optimal signal reception. I grabbed the CB microphone with a trembling hand. This is Unit 779. I don't know what transmission point you're talking about. Please identify yourself and clarify your message. The curtain that breathes. From Marcus Fry. Sigh. I've been driving long haul for 17 years now, and I thought I'd seen everything the road could throw at me. Phantom headlights in empty deserts, voices on dead radio channels, shadows that moved wrong in truck stop parking lots, but nothing prepared me for what happened during that week in November. Somewhere between Bakersfield and Phoenix, when my sleeper curtain started opening by itself. It began on a Tuesday night, about 3 hours past sunset. I was running behind schedule due to a blown tire outside of Fresno, and the dispatcher was breathing down my neck about delivery times. The rain had been coming down steady all day, turning the asphalt into a mirror that reflected the occasional passing headlight like scattered stars. My Peterbilt 309 hummed along Interstate 5, the familiar vibration of the engine settling into my bones the way it always did during these long stretches. Fluorescent lights flickered over cracked pavement, casting everything in that sickly yellow glow that makes even healthy people look like they're dying. I pulled into a spot near the back, away from the diesel pumps and the constant rumble of trucks coming and going. The rain drummed against my windshield in a rhythm that almost sounded like Morse code if you listened long enough. I'd been driving for 14 hours straight, my eyes burning from the strain of watching endless white lines disappear under my hood. The sleeper berth in my cab wasn't luxury, but it was home. The narrow bed, the small cabinet for my clothes, and that heavy curtain that separated my sleeping space from the driver's seat, all of it familiar and comforting after nearly 2 decades on the road. That first night, I was deep in sleep when something woke me. Not a sound exactly, but the absence of one. The rain had stopped, and in that sudden silence, I became aware of cool air moving across my face. I opened my eyes to find the sleeper curtain hanging open, swaying slightly as if someone had just drawn it back. The dashboard lights cast eerie shadows across the empty driver's seat, and beyond the windshield, the truck stop looked abandoned except for a few scattered rigs. I figured the curtain had just worked its way loose. These older trucks weren't exactly precision engineering, and after hundreds of thousands of miles, everything had a tendency to shift and settle in unexpected ways. I pulled the curtain closed, made sure it was secure, and went back to sleep. But even as I drifted off, I couldn't shake the feeling that the air in the cab felt different somehow, charged with an energy I couldn't quite name. The next night found me parked at a rest stop somewhere in the Mojave Desert. The landscape stretched out in all directions like the surface of an alien planet, all sagebrush and sand under a sky so clear you could see the Milky Way. I'd always loved desert nights, the way the silence seemed to have weight to it, pressing down on you like a blanket. But that night, the silence felt expectant, as if the desert was holding its breath. I'd been reading for about an hour, working my way through a paperback thriller I'd picked up at the last truck stop. When fatigue finally overtook me, I clicked off my reading light and settled into my narrow bed, listening to the distant sound of trucks passing on the interstate. The sleeper curtain was pulled tight, creating my small cocoon of darkness and warmth. Sometime around 3 in the morning, I woke to find the curtain open again. This time, I was certain I'd secured it properly before going to sleep. The metal clips that held it in place were designed to grip tight, and I'd checked them twice. Yet there it was, hanging open like a theater curtain at the end of a performance. Cool desert air flowed through the cab, carrying with it the scent of sage and something else, something organic and unfamiliar. A single vending machine hummed in the distance, its lights creating a small island of illumination in the darkness. Everything looked normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from out there in the desert night. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I found myself reluctant to get up and close the curtain, as if moving would somehow attract the attention of whatever was out there. As I did, I could have sworn I heard something, a faint sound like fabric rustling or wind moving through dry leaves. But when I paused to listen, there was only the hum of the vending machine and the distant whisper of traffic on the interstate. By the third night, I was starting to question my own sanity. I'd checked the curtain mechanism thoroughly that evening, even going so far as to tie a piece of rope around the clips to keep them secure. I was parked at a truck stop outside of Needles, California, where the desert began its inexorable transition into the wasteland that surrounded Las Vegas. The neon signs of the truck stop cast everything in garish pinks and blues, and the constant stream of traffic heading toward the casinos created a steady background hum. Not a sound this time, but a presence, as if someone was standing just outside my field of vision, waiting for me to notice them. I opened my eyes slowly, already knowing what I would find. The curtain hung open, my makeshift rope lying on the floor as if it had been carefully untied. But this time, something was different. But as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized the figure wasn't quite right. It seemed translucent, as if it were made of smoke and shadow rather than flesh and bone. It sat perfectly still, hands resting on the steering wheel, staring out at the truck stop as if waiting for something. I tried to speak, to call out and ask who was there, but my voice caught in my throat. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence in any way. It simply sat there, a passenger in my own truck, as silent and still as a photograph. The air in the cab had grown cold, and I could see my breath misting in the dim light. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the figure began to fade. It happened slowly, like a morning mist being burned away by the rising sun. First the edges became indistinct, Then the center began to thin, until finally there was nothing left but empty air, and the lingering scent of something I couldn't identify, something that reminded me of old fabric and forgotten places. I spent the rest of that night sitting up in my bunk, staring at the empty driver's seat, and trying to convince myself that I'd been dreaming. But the rope was still on the floor where I'd seen it fall, and the curtain remained open despite my best efforts to secure it. The fourth night brought me to a truck stop, just outside of Kingman, Arizona. The place had an Old West feel to it, all weathered wood and rusty metal, like something out of a cowboy movie. The wind had picked up during the day, bringing with it the scent of distant rain, and the promise of a storm moving in from the west. By the time I'd parked and settled in for the night, I could hear thunder rumbling somewhere beyond the horizon. Whatever was happening in my cab, whatever presence had taken up residence in my truck, it seemed determined to make itself known. Instead, I lay in my bunk with the curtain open, watching the empty driver's seat and waiting to see what would happen next. The storm arrived just after midnight, bringing with it sheets of rain that hammered against my windshield, and lightning that turned the truck stop into a strobing black and white photograph. The thunder was so loud it seemed to shake the ground, and the wind rocked my truck on its suspension like a boat on rough water. In the brief moment of illumination, I could make out details I'd missed before. It was wearing what looked like an old-fashioned trucking uniform, the kind drivers wore back in the 50s and 60s. The face was thin and weathered, with deep lines around the eyes that spoke of years spent staring down endless highways. This time it turned to look at me, and I found myself staring into eyes that seemed to hold the weight of 1,000 lonely miles. There was no malice in that gaze, no threat or anger. The Gathering at mile marker 2, from Jake Thornfield. My Peterbilt's headlights carved through the darkness, illuminating the familiar rhythm of white lines and reflector posts. But there was an unusual density to the shadows gathering along the roadside. The CB radio had been quiet for the past hour, which was strange for this stretch of I-40 through Arkansas, and the only sound filling my cab was the steady rumble of the diesel engine and the occasional whisper of wind against the trailer. I'd been running this route between Memphis and Little Rock for 7 years, hauling everything from auto parts to frozen goods, and I knew every exit, every truck stop, every speed trap by heart. Exit 247 was supposed to be nothing special, just another off-ramp leading to a cluster of gas stations and a small farming community called Millbrook. But as my headlights swept across the green highway sign announcing the upcoming exit, something made me ease off the throttle and pay closer attention to what lay ahead. At first it looked like scattered debris along the shoulder, dark, irregular shapes that could have been blown tire fragments or roadkill. But as I drew closer, maintaining a steady 65 miles per hour in the right lane, the shapes began to resolve into something that made my hands tighten on the steering wheel. They were birds, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all perfectly still and arranged in neat rows along both sides of the exit ramp, like they were waiting for something. Every single one of them was a crow, their black feathers barely distinguishable from the asphalt in the darkness, except for the way my headlights caught the occasional glint of a bead-bright eye, or the subtle sheen of a wing. They weren't scattered randomly like birds that had been struck by vehicles or died naturally. Instead, they appeared deliberately positioned, forming precise lines that extended from the highway shoulder all the way up the exit ramp, and disappearing into the darkness beyond my headlight range. The logical part of my mind tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe there had been some kind of agricultural spraying in the area, or a disease outbreak that had affected the local bird population. I'd heard of such things happening before, entire flocks succumbing to illness or environmental factors, but the arrangement was too orderly, too purposeful, and as I passed the exit doing 65, I could have sworn I saw movement in my peripheral vision, as if hundreds of heads had turned in unison to track my truck's passage. I keyed the CB radio and called out to any drivers who might be listening. Breaker 19. This is Thornfield Transport eastbound at mile marker 2. Anyone else notice anything unusual about that last exit? Static filled the cab for long seconds. Then a gravelly voice responded with the distinctive drawl of a veteran driver. "That's a big negative, driver. Been past there 3 times this week. Nothing but the usual roadside attractions. You feeling all right? Maybe time to pull over for some coffee and a stretch?" I thanked the unknown driver and signed off, but his response only deepened my unease. Either I was seeing things that weren't there, which was a terrifying possibility after 14 hours on the road, or something was happening at exit 24/7 that other drivers weren't experiencing. The fuel gauge showed 3/4 full, so I wasn't in immediate danger of running out of diesel, but my next scheduled stop was still 2 hours away in Little Rock. As I continued eastbound, I found myself checking the mirrors more frequently than usual, though I wasn't sure what I expected to see. The highway behind me remained empty except for the occasional pair of headlights in the distance, and the darkness seemed to swallow everything beyond the reach of my taillights. But there was a weight to that darkness now, a sense of being observed that made the hair on my arms stand up, despite the comfortable warmth of the cab. A construction zone appeared without warning. Orange barrels and electronic signs forcing traffic into a single lane and reducing speed to 45 miles per hour. The delay would add at least an hour to my drive time, and with my logbook already pushing the legal limits, I made the decision that would change everything. I would take the next exit, find an alternate route through the back roads, and rejoin the interstate further east. The irony wasn't lost on me when I saw the green sign emerging from the darkness ahead. Exit 2047, Millbrook, next right. In my years of driving, I'd learned to trust coincidences about as much as I trusted four-wheelers in rush hour traffic. But I had limited options. The construction backup was getting worse, and my delivery schedule left no room for extended delays. I signaled right and began the gradual descent down the exit ramp, my headlights sweeping across asphalt that appeared completely normal and empty. Not a single black feather or small dark shape remained where I had seen thousands of birds just 20 minutes earlier. The roadside was clean, almost unnaturally so, as if it had been swept and scrubbed. I should have felt relieved, but instead a chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the October air seeping through the cab's weather stripping. At the bottom of the ramp, a stop sign marked the intersection with County Road 15, and beyond that the dim glow of streetlights outlined what looked like a typical rural gas station and convenience store. The kind of place that sold coffee that had been brewing since morning, stale donuts, and enough energy drinks to keep a driver alert for the final stretch of a long haul. I parked the truck in the empty lot, set the air brakes, and climbed down from the cab to stretch my legs and assess my alternate route option. The silence was absolute. No traffic noise from the interstate. No hum of fluorescent lights, no distant sound of civilization. Even the wind had died to nothing, leaving me standing in a bubble of unnatural quiet that seemed to press against my eardrums. The gas station's windows were lit, but I couldn't see any movement inside, and there were no other vehicles in the parking lot, despite the late hour when truck stops usually saw their heaviest traffic. I walked toward the building, my boots crunching on gravel that sounded unnaturally loud in the silence, and noticed that the price signs were dark. No glowing numbers announcing fuel costs, no electronic displays cycling through promotions and advertisement. Through the windows I could see rows of merchandise and coolers filled with beverages, but everything appeared slightly wrong somehow, like a movie set designed to look like a convenience store, but missing the subtle details that would make it convincing. The door was unlocked and opened, with a soft chime that seemed to hang in the air longer than it should have. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed with the irregular flicker that usually indicates failing ballasts, casting shifting shadows between the aisles. The register counter was unmanned, though a half-empty coffee cup sat next to the cash drawer as if the attendant had stepped away moments before my arrival. I called out a greeting, but my voice seemed muffled and strange, like I was speaking inside a large empty building rather than a small convenience store. No response came from the back rooms or service bay. The coffee machine was empty, though still warm to the touch, and the hot food rollers were spinning with nothing on them. It was as if the place had been abandoned in the middle of normal operations, everything left running but no people anywhere to be found. That's when I heard the first soft tap against the windows, then another, Then dozens of small impacts like hail beginning to fall, except the night was clear and cloudless. I moved to the front of the store and looked out through the glass, and my blood turned to ice water in my veins. They were back. Thousands of crows perched on my truck, covering every surface from the hood to the trailer doors. More were landing every second, dropping from the sky in a steady black rain that made no sound except for the gentle tap of claws against metal and glass. They weren't cawing or making any of the usual noise associated with a large flock of birds. Instead, they simply perched in perfect silence, all facing the same direction, all looking directly at me through the convenience store window. I backed away from the glass and tried to think rationally about my situation. Birds, even large numbers of them, were not inherently dangerous to a person inside a building, but the unnatural behavior, the perfect silence, and the way they had appeared and disappeared with no apparent cause suggested that rational thinking might not apply to whatever was happening at X. The CB radio in my truck would be useless with thousands of birds covering the vehicle, and my cell phone showed no signal bars, despite being in an area that normally had decent coverage. I was effectively cut off from communication, stranded in an apparently abandoned gas station, with my only means of transportation buried under a living black carpet that showed no signs of dispersing.